The first thing he felt was cold. Not the cold of winter, nor the cold of a hospital, the cold of the stone floor against his bare knees. The second thing he felt was a stranger's hand on his forehead. The fingers smelled of wax and something bitter. The third thing he felt was his whole body becoming small, narrow, light, as if someone had picked him up and shrunk him to the size of a child. He opened his eyes. Standing before him was an old man in white robes, holding a crystal the size of a fist. The crystal flashed white, then it went dark. The old man pulled his hand away. The crowd behind him rustled. Someone snorted. Someone sighed. The old man looked down at him and uttered a single word. Rank F. Empty. Ethan Crane didn't know what rank F was. He didn't know what the assessment ritual was. He didn't know why he was 12 years old or why his knees were pressed against the temple's stone slabs. 30 seconds ago, he had been behind the wheel on a highway outside Boston. 30 seconds ago, he was 27. 30 seconds ago, he'd closed his eyes for a single second because he hadn't slept for 60 hours straight. And now, here he was, in a stranger's body. In a strange world, with a life sentence he hadn't even had time to comprehend. A large man with scorched hands stood at the temple's exit, and Ethan didn't recognize him. But the body did. His legs moved toward him on their own. The man placed a heavy hand on the top of his head and said that it was all right. That rank wasn't what mattered, that his hands were strong and his mind was sharp, and everything would be all right. The man's voice faltered on the last word. Ethan realized that this man was lying, and that this man was his father. For the first week, Ethan remained silent. He listened, he watched, he memorized. The world was called expensive as it sounded, the Kingdom of Aurelian, a continent with 4 cardinal directions and 1 great river to the east. People here were born with something they called the vein, an internal mana channel. It was measured once every 12 years and rated on a scale from F to SSS. Your rank determined everything: who you would become, who you'd marry, how much land you'd receive, who would bow to you, and to whom you would bow. An F rank meant rock bottom. You couldn't go any lower, an empty channel, not a drop of mana. To this world, Ethan Crane had been trash from the moment he was born. To Ethan Crane, who 30 seconds ago had been calculating the heat exchange of turbine blades on a military contract, this was simply a new set of conditions. He was used to conditions. His father turned out to be a blacksmith, Master Gregor Crane, broad as a wardrobe, kind as bread, hands scarred by old burns from the forge. He forged horseshoes and nails for a shop on the outskirts of the capital. Not the best blacksmith in town, but not the worst either. Honest, poor, with debts of 340 silver coins that grew every month because the shopkeeper borrowed materials and couldn't cover the costs with sales. For the first week, Ethan simply stood next to his father by the forge and watched, and what he saw made him grit his teeth. Gregor forged according to his grandfather's tradition. He heated the blank until it glowed red. He struck it with the hammer exactly 20 times. He cooled it in water. He repeated the process. That's how his father did it. That's how his father's father did it. That's how all the blacksmiths of Aurelian did it. And in doing so, they lost 60% of the finished product's strength. Ethan could see this because in a past life he had read about 18th century metallurgy simply for pleasure. He could see that the temperature was too high, that the cooling was too abrupt, that the grain structure in the steel was breaking at a point the local blacksmiths didn't know about and couldn't have known because they had neither a microscope nor a textbook. But he couldn't say anything. He was 12. He was an F rank. He was the son of a blacksmith in debt. Who would listen to him? In the second week, Ethan began helping out with small tasks. He handed tools, he pumped the bellows, he scraped away scale, and in between, he started doing things that Gregor didn't notice. He kept the workpiece in the furnace a little longer. He poured the quenching water a little more slowly. He shifted the bellows half a breath earlier so the temperature in the furnace would be more even. Gregor didn't understand why, for the past 2 weeks, his nails had stopped bending. Why the horseshoes were lasting a third longer. He chalked it up to a good batch of ore. Ethan didn't correct him. After 3 months, he already knew this world well enough. Language wasn't a problem. His body had remembered it since birth. Ethan simply added an engineer's vocabulary and the habit of thinking 2 steps ahead. He learned about the great houses, Irving, Castle, and Volcor, Hanes, 4 families that held the kingdom by the throat. Each house had mana mines and legions of warriors, as well as sons with ranks of A and higher. The houses decided who to trade with, who to fight, who would live, and who would die. The only thing they couldn't decide was who would sit on the throne. The throne belonged to the Aurelian dynasty, and as long as the king of the house sat on the throne, the houses tolerated one another. A year later, his father fell ill. The fever came on suddenly. In the morning, Gregor was coughing. By evening, he was flat on his back. A week later, he still couldn't get up. Ethan ran all over town looking for a doctor. The doctor arrived. He looked at Gregor. He looked at the shack. He looked at the boy with an F rank. He named his price. 50 silver coins for the examination, 100 for the medicine, 200 for the course of treatment. Ethan had 3 copper coins. The doctor left. Gregor died 9 days later, quietly, in his sleep. The last thing he told his son was not to forget to blow out the horn before going to sleep. Ethan buried him in the city cemetery at public expense. A grave without a headstone, a cross made of 2 sticks. The debt of 340 silver coins fell to him. He was 13 years old. For the next 7 years, Ethan survived. He didn't live, he survived. An apprentice to a cooper, a laborer at the river wharf, an errand boy for a notary, a clerk working for room and board at that same notary's office when the notary discovered that the boy could write more fluently than he could. Every month, Ethan set aside 3 silver coins toward the debt. Every month, the debt grew by 5 silver coins due to interest. The math was simple and ruthless. He would never pay off this debt. His body was growing, wiry and lean. His hands bore old burns from the blacksmith's forge. He had the eyes of a man who counts every copper coin and knows that the world owes him nothing. In 7 years, Ethan never once complained. He never cried. He never asked for help, not because he was strong, but because there was no one to complain to. He studied this world the way an engineer studies a new project, systematically, methodically, without emotion. He understood how Aurelian's economy worked. The houses control the mana mines. Mana fuels magic. Magic fuels the army. The army holds the territory. Territory generates taxes. Taxes sustain the houses. A vicious cycle in which there is no place for a young man with an F rank and a debt of 340 silver. He understood how politics worked. The old king had been ill for a long time. There was only one heir, Princess Celesta Aurelian, rank S, 19 years old. According to ancient law, she must choose a husband from among the sons of the great houses within a year of her father's death. Otherwise, the throne is declared vacant and the houses begin slaughtering one another for the right to sit on it first. Across the river lies the Dragmar Empire. It waits. When the Aurelians split apart, Dragmar will step in and pick up the pieces. Ethan understood all this by the time he was 20, and not once did he think that it concerned him personally. He was a scribe, rank F. Salary, 340 silver pieces. What did he care about thrones and princesses? And then the old king died, and it all began. The letter arrived on Thursday, an ordinary envelope with an official seal, and Ethan opened it with a letter opener at Notary Brem's desk where he was finalizing a grain supply contract. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick paper, the Aurelian family's golden coat of arms at the top. The text was brief. According to the law of succession, paragraph 9, section 4, all adult males of the kingdom with a rank higher than F have the right to be presented to Princess Celeste Aurelian as candidates for marriage. Ethan reread it. With a rank higher than F, his rank was exactly F, no higher. He turned the sheet over. On the back, in the secretary's small handwriting, a note had been added by hand. Clarification. The wording includes rank F and above. We apologize for the inaccuracy in the first draft. Ethan looked at this clarification. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the seal. Genuine. He set the letter on the table and returned to the grain contract. 3 days later, a second letter arrived. Mandatory attendance. The throne room. Date. Time. Formal attire. Ethan didn't have any formal attire. He had one doublet for funerals, brown, with a patch on the elbow, smelling like a trunk. His neighbor on the same floor, the widow Karen, had lent him her late husband's doublet, dark blue, almost without holes, slightly wide in the shoulders. Ethan promised to return it clean. On the morning of the hearing, he got up before dawn. He washed his face with cold water. He put on the borrowed doublet. He looked at himself in a shard of mirror above the wash basin. A gaunt face, dark eyes, hands scarred by old burns. A 20-year-old guy in someone else's clothes, with a debt of 340 silver coins, walking to the palace to be chosen as a husband for the princess. Not to be a husband, to be on the list, to stand in line, bow, leave, go home, finish yesterday's bread, carry on with life. The throne room was enormous. The ceiling was lost in the twilight. White stone columns soared upward like trees in a forest. The black marble floor reflected the light of hundreds of candles. Ethan stood fifth in line, fifth and last. To his right stood Richard Irving, 24 years old, an SS officer, golden epaulets on his shoulders, a white uniform without a single crease. His face was handsome and smooth as a coin. He looked right through Ethan as if he were glass. Not with contempt. Contempt requires effort. Irving simply didn't see him. To him, the fifth spot in the row was an empty space. A secretary's mistake. Thin air. To the left stood Darius Castle, 22 years old, rank A, dark hair down to his shoulders, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was the only one who looked at Ethan. He glanced at the stranger's doublet, a patch on the elbow, burns on his hands. And he turned away, with the same expression a person uses when looking away from a wet spot on the wall. The third was Marcus Volkor, 21 years old, rank A, broad-shouldered like his father, silent, hands clasped behind his back, eyes unmoving. He wasn't looking at anyone, he was waiting. Fourth was Leon Haynes, 20 years old, rank A, the youngest of the four houses. Nervous. His fingers were trembling. He clearly understood that he had the least chance of all and was standing there only because his father had ordered him to. Ethan stood last, in someone else's doublet, with a patch on his elbow, and he had only one thought. She's going to name Irving now, it's obvious. Rank SS. The House of Irving is the strongest of the four, a logical choice. He'll bow, he'll go home, he'll finish yesterday's bread. Everything's fine. Everything's going according to plan. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Celeste Aurelian entered alone. No entourage, no ladies-in-waiting, no guards. That was the first thing Ethan noticed and the first thing that put him on guard. A princess doesn't enter alone. A princess enters surrounded by at least 20 people. That's protocol. That's the law. She broke it the very first second. Celeste was tall. Her light hair was pulled back. Her dress was silver. Simple. No jewelry. Her face was calm. Cold. Her eyes were gray like a winter sky. She walked across the black marble, the heels of her shoes clicking in the silence of the hall like a metronome. 200 courtiers on either side of the hall remained silent. She approached the throne. She didn't sit down. She turned toward the row of suitors. Her gaze swept over them from left to right. Leon Haynes, Marcus Volkor, Darius Castle, Richard Irving. She lingered on Irving for a second, maybe two. Irving lifted his chin slightly. He was bracing himself. The entire hall was bracing itself. Ethan saw Lady Irving in the front row already clasping her hands in preparation to applaud. And then Celeste stepped down from the stage. Slowly, without rushing, she walked past Irving, past Castle, past Volkor, past Haynes, and stopped in front of the last person in the row. In front of Ethan. She stood close, so close that he could see the thin scar on her left temple. An old one, from childhood. She looked him in the eyes. Not down on him, even though she was half a head taller in her heels, but straight on, as an equal. Ethan stopped breathing. Not because she was beautiful, but he stopped breathing because in her eyes he saw something that shouldn't have been there. Recognition. She recognized him. She had never seen him before. He had never been in the courtyard, but in her gray eyes was recognition, as if she'd been searching for him her whole life and had finally found him. Celeste said his name, Ethan Crane. You will be my husband. The hall grew so quiet that he heard Lady Irving's fan fall. A small bone fan with a golden tassel struck the marble floor, and the sound echoed throughout the throne room. Ethan had one clear thought. She had just signed her own death warrant, and it seemed to him so too. Richard Irving turned his head, slowly. For the first time, he truly looked at Ethan, not through him, not past him, straight into his eyes. And there was no surprise in that gaze. There was a promise. Darius Castle smiled. The smile still didn't reach his eyes, but his teeth flashed. Marcus Volkor didn't move. Only his fingers behind his back clenched into fists. Leon Haynes exhaled. Briefly, with relief. 200 courtiers buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Celeste didn't turn around. She stood before Ethan and waited. Protocol demanded a response. Consent. Or refusal. Ethan could refuse. He could say no. Bow. Leave. Return to his room above the bakery. To yesterday's bread and a debt of 340 silver coins. To a life that was hard but understandable. Safe in its poverty. He looked at Celeste. At the scar on her temple. At her hands. Her fingers were clenched. Her knuckles were white. She was afraid. An S-rank princess who had just turned the politics of the entire kingdom upside down with a single 4-word sentence stood before him, afraid that he would say no. Ethan Crane was an engineer. Engineers don't believe in fate. They believe in calculations. And by any calculation, he had to say no. Turn around, walk away, survive. He said yes. Because engineers still believe in the conditions of the problem. And the condition before him was this. A girl in a silver dress with a scar on her temple and white knuckles stood before him, afraid. And he'd spent his whole life fixing broken things. That evening, they led him to his quarters, the prince consort's quarters. 3 rooms, a bedroom, a study, and a parlor. The bed was wider than his entire room above the bakery. The blanket was made of the kind of silk he'd only seen in pictures at the fabric store. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He touched the brink. He did the math in his head. That quilt was worth more than his entire debt, more than all his past possessions, more than everything he'd earned in 7 years. The blanket. He didn't lie down. He sat there until late into the night. He thought. The 4 great houses. Each one wanted the throne. Each one now hated him personally. Irving would seek revenge. Castle would dig for dirt. Volcor would beat him. Haynes would wait. The Dragmar Empire across the river. The courtiers who would begin making his life a living hell tomorrow. The servants who would despise him. The guards who would not protect him. And Celeste, who had chosen him for a reason he did not understand, for a purpose he cannot see, according to a logic for which he has no explanation whatsoever. Ethan Crane sat in the prince consort's chambers on a bed worth his life and focused on a single engineering problem. Input data incomplete. Resources, 0. Enemies, 4 or more. Allies, 0. Life expectancy under current conditions, 2 weeks to 4 months. The objective? Survive. He lay down, closed his eyes, and thought that the morning would tell. He woke up from the warmth, not from a sound, not from light, from the warmth in his chest, as if someone had placed a hot stone from the furnace on his ribs. Not scorching, steady, deep. Ethan opened his eyes. It was getting light outside the window, a pink streak above the palace roofs, the first dawn of his new life as prince consort. And then a voice sounded in his head. Calm, male, slightly weary, as if the speaker wasn't doing this for the first time and was a little tired of the repetition. Daily talent acquired. Perfect pitch for medal. SSS rank. Valid for 24 hours. Ethan sat up in bed. Silence. The voice vanished. No one was in the room. The door was closed. The windows were shut. He sat motionless for a minute. 2. 3. Then he slowly raised his hand and tapped the metal bed frame with his knuckle. A sound. An ordinary sound, but not quite ordinary. He heard something in that sound he'd never heard before, a frequency, a depth, a resonance. The metal of the frame was low-carbon steel, soft, with a carbon content of approximately 0.2%. 3 inclusions of slag near the left hinge, a micro-crack at the top bolt. He didn't need to check. He just knew. 1 tap with his knuckle, and he knew everything there was to know about that piece of metal. Ethan looked at his hands. The same burns, the same F rank. But now, in his head, was an ability that no one else in this world possessed. SSS. For 24 hours, he stood up, got dressed. The camisole belonging to the widow Karen, which he had never returned because he'd been living in the palace since yesterday. He stepped out into the hallway. The palace hallway was empty. Not a single servant, not a single guard. Usually, at least 2 were on duty in the prince consort's wing. Ethan had seen this last night when he was escorted out. Now, no one. The first sign. They had already begun to put pressure on him. He walked down the hallway alone. He found the staircase. He went downstairs. He found the kitchen by the smell. The palace's large kitchen. The heat from the ovens. The clatter of dishes. 3 chefs and a dozen assistants. Ethan stopped at the doorway. The head chef looked at him. Ethan asked for breakfast. The chef said that the prince consort's breakfast was served in his chambers and that he should go back and wait. Ethan went back. He waited for an hour. Breakfast wasn't brought. He went back down to the kitchen. The chef told him to wait again. Ethan nodded. He headed for the palace exit. He found the gate. The guard at the gate looked at him. Ethan asked where he could buy bread. The guard pointed him in the right direction. Ethan went out. He bought bread with his own money, 2 copper coins for a quarter loaf. He returned. He ate in his chambers, alone. That was the second sign. The cook hadn't forgotten. The cook had received instructions. The question was, from whom? Ethan finished his bread and went to look for Celeste. He didn't find her. The princess was at the morning council meeting. Protocol does not allow the prince consort access to the council until the wedding ceremony. The wedding is in a month without access to his wife, a month without protection, a month in which he could be killed in 10 different ways and no one would notice. Ethan returned to his chambers. He sat down at the desk in his study. He found a piece of paper and a quill. He made a list. What he needed right now. First, food. Solvable. He has money for bread, not for long, but he has some. Second, information. Who here is a friend? Who is an enemy? Who is neutral? Third, an ally. At least one person in this palace who doesn't want him dead. He looked at the list. He looked at his hands. He remembered the voice. An absolute ear for metal. 24 hours. And then there was a knock at the door. A servant entered. Young, pale, eyes fixed on the floor. He announced that Her Highness Princess Celeste requested that the prince consort visit necessities to select a personal weapon, as befits the husband of the heir to the throne. Ethan looked at the servant. The servant did not raise his eyes. Ethan thanked him. He asked the servant's name. The servant flinched. He said his name was Thomas. Ethan made a mental note of it. The palace armory was located in the basement of the east wing. A staircase led down. Stone walls. The smell of oil and iron. A horn at the far end. Racks of weapons lined the walls. Swords, spears, axes, daggers, shields. Ethan went downstairs and saw an old man, Magnus Hall, the court armorer, in his 60s, gray-haired, skinny as a stick. His hands bore the same burn scars as Ethan's. His eyes were sharp, angry. He stood by the anvil and looked at Ethan with the expression an old master gives to someone who's come at the wrong time. Magnus said the princess had ordered him to select a weapon, and he would do so. He took a training sword from the wall, a wooden hilt, a blunt blade. A weapon for boys learning to wield a sword. He held it out to Ethan. Ethan didn't take it. He stood there, staring at the wall of swords. 30 blades, of varying lengths, different styles of forging, different ages, and each one made a sound. Not in the usual sense, not in the sense that a bell or a string makes a sound. Each blade sang its own note. Ethan heard them all at once. 30 voices, 30 stories, 30 personalities. He walked over to the wall. He took down the first sword. He lightly tapped the flat side of the blade near the hilt with his fingernail. The sound went into the metal and came back. Ethan heard a crack, a deep one, at the base of the tang, invisible to the eye. He put the sword back. He took down the second one. He tapped it. The edge was tempered unevenly. The right edge was harder than the left. With a strong blow, the blade would split. He put it back. The third one. He tapped it. The steel was good, but the tang was set crookedly. The sword would pull his hand to the right. He set it down. He went through all 30 swords, one by one. A click, the sound, the verdict. Magnus stood behind him, silently. Ethan stopped at the 27th blade. He picked it up. Click. He froze. Silence. No, not silence. The perfect sound. Pure. Even. Not a single false note. The carbon was distributed evenly. The grain is fine. The tempering is flawless. The balance is perfect. This blade was flawless. Ethan turned to Magnus. Looking quietly and politely at the floor, he said that the first blade had a crack at the base of the tang and would break on the third strike. The second one had a poorly tempered edge and would crumble. But this 27th one is perfect. And he asked who had forged it. Magnus was silent for a long time. His hands trembled slightly. He replied hoarsely that it was his father, 50 years ago, and that he thought he was the only one in the kingdom who could hear it. Ethan stood with the sword in his hand, and something clicked in his head. Not in the engineer's head, in the head of that other Ethan. That little boy who, at the age of 8,
had stood by the forge next to his father and listened to the metal sing. He understood the task, not because the voice had spoken. The voice was silent. But Ethan understood. An absolute ear for metal. A hidden task. To hear the one who listens.
To find a master who hears the same way, and to acknowledge his mastery. His chest grew hot. For a second, a brief flash of warmth and a quiet ringing, as if somewhere far away someone had struck a bell. His talent was preserved forever. Ethan gave nothing away. He stood calmly, holding the sword. Magnus looked at him, no longer with angry eyes, with different ones. The old man held out his hand. Ethan handed him the blade. Magnus took it gently, as if it were a living creature. He turned it toward the light and said that this sword would be his, the prince consort's, if the prince consort would allow the old blacksmith to restore it to working order. Ethan nodded. He thanked him. He turned toward the exit. Magnus called out to him. He asked where he'd learned to do that. Ethan stopped. He thought for a moment. He replied that his father had been a blacksmith, and that his father had taught him to listen. It was the truth. Not the whole truth, but the truth. Magnus nodded. That same evening, Magnus Hall came to the palace. Not to the armory, upstairs. To the prince consort's chambers. He knocked. He entered. He stood by the door, and said he wanted to serve. Not the princess. Not the crown, Prince Consort Ethan Crane, personally. Ethan was sitting at a table. Before him lay a 3-point list: food, information, and ally. He looked at Magnus, at his burn-scarred hands, at his eyes. The first ally, not bribed, not intimidated, heard. Ethan stood up. He bowed. He said it would be an honor. Magnus bowed in return, deeper, and left. Ethan sat back down. He picked up a quill. He crossed out the third item on the list. On the third day, Ethan woke up and waited. The voice came at dawn. The same one, calm, steady. Daily talent received. Thermal vision, rank SSS, valid for 24 hours. Ethan sat up in bed. Thermal vision. He closed his eyes and opened them again. The world had changed. Not the color, not the shape, the depth. He could see heat. The wall in front of him was uneven. The right corner was 6 degrees colder than the left. A crack in the masonry. A draft from the hallway. The floor by the door was warmer than by the window. Enough of a trace. Someone had been standing outside his door at night. For a long time. 20 minutes. Ethan looked at the trace. 2 feet. Large size. A man. He'd been standing there motionless. Listening. Or waiting. Ethan memorized it. He got dressed. He stepped out into the hallway. The hallway radiated warmth. Footprints from the servants, warm spots on the doorknobs, cooling streaks where people had walked an hour ago. Ethan saw the palace as a heat map, and this map told him what no spy could ever tell him. The west wing of the palace was cold, abnormally cold. Ethan walked through the hallways. The farther west he went, the colder it got. The walls were covered with frost in the corners. The floors were icy. Not a single servant in sight. Empty rooms. And at the very end of the west wing, a single closed door from which not a trace of warmth escaped. Ethan stopped in front of it. Someone lived behind that door. There was a fresh handprint on the doorknob. Slender fingers, those of an elderly person. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again. A voice came from behind the door. Quiet. A woman's. An old woman's. "Who's there?" Ethan identified himself. Prince Consort Ethan Crane. A long pause. The door opened. Queen Mother Eleanor Aurelian stood in the doorway. Small, thin, wrapped in 3 blankets. Her face was pale with a grayish tinge. Her eyes were dull. She looked up at him, and there was neither majesty nor authority in her gaze. Only coldness and weariness. She said she hadn't summoned him. Ethan replied that he had come on his own, because the furnace in her wing of the palace wasn't working. The Queen Mother frowned slightly. She said the stove hadn't been working since the beginning of winter. That she'd told the steward 3 times. The steward had promised. Craftsmen had come. They looked. They left. Nothing changed. Ethan asked permission to look at the stove. The Queen Mother looked at him for a long time, at his doublet, at his hands. Then she silently stepped aside. The stove stood in the far corner of her chambers, large, stone, tiled with the Aurelian coat of arms, beautiful, dead. Ethan approached. He placed his hand on the stone, cold. He peered into the firebox, empty, clean, too clean. He peered into the chimney. With his thermal vision, he saw everything at once. The chimney was blocked, not with soot, with stones. Someone had filled the chimney with cobblestones from the inside, at a height of about 2 meters, so you can't see it from the outside, or from the inside either. You'd have to climb up to spot it. Or have SSS rank thermal vision. Ethan straightened up. He looked at the Queen Mother. He told her the problem was with the chimney, that he'd fix it by evening. He went outside. He found Magnus. He explained. Magnus frowned. He said that the stones in the chimney weren't a malfunction. It was someone's doing. Ethan nodded. He already knew. Someone wanted the Queen Mother to freeze, to get sick, to grow weak, to quietly pass away. The question of who stood to gain from this was rhetorical. All 4 houses. A weak Queen Mother means a weak Celeste. A weak Celeste means the throne is up for grabs. Ethan and Magnus spent 3 hours on the roof. Magnus climbed into the chimney. Ethan pointed out exactly where the stones were. Thermal vision showed each cobblestone as a cold, dark spot in a column of warm air. They pulled out 18 stones. Each was about the size of 2 fists. Ethan stacked them in the courtyard, a pile, in plain sight. Then they cleaned out the chimney. They relit the stove. By evening, the west wing of the palace began to come alive. The walls warmed up. The frost on the corners began to melt. Light spilled from under the Queen Mother's door. Ethan knocked. The Queen Mother opened it. She was wearing 2 blankets instead of 3. Ethan told her the stove was working, and that if she'd allow it, he'd come by tomorrow to check the draft. The Queen Mother looked at him for a long time. Then she quietly said thank you. Ethan bowed. He left. He returned to his quarters. He sat down at the table. His thermal vision was still working. He looked at the wall. Behind the wall in the hallway stood a man, a warm silhouette, large. He stood motionless. The same one from last night, watching. Ethan didn't go to the door. He sat down at the table, took a piece of paper, and began to draw. A diagram of the palace's heating system. All of them. Earlier that day, while walking through the hallways, he'd seen a thermal map of the entire building. He knew where it was hot, where it was cold, where there were heat losses, where there were leaks. The West Wing was the worst, but by no means the only problem area. The Aurelian Palace was losing about 65% of its heat through poor masonry, cracks in the walls, and chimneys that hadn't been swept in years. Ethan sketched and calculated. If the stoves were rebuilt properly, with the right draft and heat-retaining masonry, heat loss could be reduced to 20%. The same amount of coal, 3 times as much heat. This would save the treasury about 4,000 silver coins a year on coal alone. Plus, people would stop getting sick from the cold. Plus, the servants would start working more efficiently when they weren't shivering in the mornings. He drew until midnight. His thermal vision faded at dawn the next day. Quietly, like the morning fog. He hadn't completed the secret mission. He didn't know what it was. Maybe he was supposed to find the one who had placed the stones in the chimney. Maybe it was something else. His talent was gone. It hurt. Not physically. The world had become flat again, without depth, without warmth. Ordinary eyes, ordinary F rank. But the diagram remained, the knowledge remained, and 18 stones lay in a neat pile in the courtyard, in plain sight. On the 4th day, Ethan took the diagram and went to see the palace steward. The steward was a man of the House of Castle. Ethan had learned this from Magnus. The steward listened to him. He looked at the diagram. He said it was interesting, that he would pass it on to the masters, that it would take time. Ethan nodded. He went out, and he didn't go back to his room. He went to the Queen Mother. He knocked. He went in. He sat down by her fireplace, and he told her everything. About the stones in the chimney, about the manager who had promised 3 times and done nothing, about how someone wanted her to freeze. The Queen Mother listened in silence. She sipped her tea. Then she asked why he was telling her this. Ethan replied that it was because she deserved to know the truth, and because he couldn't fix what he couldn't see. And she saw the court better than any spy, because she'd been living here for 40 years. The Queen Mother set down her cup. She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled, subtly, just with her lips. She said that he was either the most cunning person she'd ever met or the most honest, and that in either case he'd better be careful. Ethan replied that he'd try. The Queen Mother nodded and began to speak. She spoke for 2 hours, about the court, about the houses, about the servants, who was connected to whom, who paid whom, who hated whom, who pretended to be a friend and who pretended to be an enemy. She knew everything. 40 years at court, the king's wife, the princess's mother, a woman whom everyone considered weak, sick, and harmless. That was precisely why people said things in her presence that they wouldn't say in front of others. Ethan listened. He memorized it all. He didn't take notes. Notes can be found. Memories cannot. By the end of the conversation, he knew more about the Aurelian court than he had in all the previous 8 years of living in the capital. He knew that the palace steward received a monthly stipend from the House of Castle, that the head of the palace guard, Reynold Irving, was a cousin of Richard Irving, that the chef who forgets to serve him is married to the daughter of the House of Volcor's stablemaster, that the only person in Celeste's inner circle who could be fully trusted was the head of her personal security, Hannah Jew. Ethan bowed. He thanked him. He promised to stop by tomorrow. He promised to bring some broth. The Queen Mother asked what kind of broth. Ethan replied that it was chicken broth, simple, with onions, garlic, and salt, that his mother used to make it like that when she was sick. The Queen Mother said she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything not prepared by a palace chef. Ethan said he'd remember tomorrow. On the 5th day, the talent was useless. Daily talent acquired. Absolute body coordination. Rank SSS. Lasts 24 hours. Ethan stood up. He tried it. He picked up a pen from the table. The pen froze in his fingers as if glued there. No tremors, no micro movements, complete control over every muscle. He could draw a perfect circle freehand. He could walk a tightrope. He could juggle knives. A beautiful ability, completely useless in his current situation. Or maybe not, Ethan thought. Today is the 5th day. In 25 days, the wedding. In 25 days, he will officially become Prince Consort and gain access to Celeste and the Council. 25 days without protection. Last night, someone was standing outside his door again. His servant Thomas said he'd been told to be ready for a visit tomorrow, but they didn't say who was coming or why. Ethan decided not to wait for the visit. He got dressed. He took his list. Numbers 1 and 2 had been crossed out. Food, settled. He bought his own bread and carried it with him. Plus, yesterday the Queen Mother had ordered her personal maid to bring him tea in the mornings. Not out of generosity. It was a calculated move. She wanted her eyes on him every morning. Ethan understood this and didn't object. An ally. Magnus Hall. Information. The Queen Mother. That left the 4th item, which he'd added last night. Money. Without money, he couldn't do anything. All his savings amounted to 11 silver coins and a handful of copper ones. The debt of 340 silver coins hadn't gone anywhere. His creditors were keeping quiet for now because he was now the princess's husband. But if he were killed or if the marriage were annulled, the debt would come due, with interest. Ethan went down to the kitchen. Not for a meal this time. He was just passing by. But he stopped. A woman was standing in the kitchen. She was large and broad-shouldered. Her hands were red from the hot water. Her face was round, kind eyes. She was scolding the junior assistant for a dirty pot. Her voice was loud and warm at the same time. Ethan recognized her from the Queen Mother's description. Martha, a cook, not the head chef, the second in command. She cooked for the servants, not for the masters. She'd worked at the palace for 22 years. Her husband had died of a fever. She had no children. She lived right there in the basement next to the kitchen. She was the only one in the kitchen who wasn't affiliated with any of the houses. Just a cook. She just does her job. Ethan approached. He said hello. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and curtsied. It felt awkward. She wasn't used to curtsying. Ethan asked if he could borrow a pot, a small one. He wanted to make broth for the Queen Mother. Martha's eyes widened. The Prince Consort wants to cook? By himself? In her kitchen? Ethan said yes, that he knows how to cook one thing, chicken broth, and that he'd be grateful if she'd lend him a pot and a little space by the stove. Martha looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she smiled broadly and said that a pot was no problem, but if he was going to cook in her kitchen, he'd have to do it right and she'd make sure of it. Ethan nodded. He bought a chicken at the market with his own money, 2 silver coins, onions, garlic, salt. He returned to the kitchen. Martha was standing nearby, watching. Ethan washed his hands with boiling water. Martha raised an eyebrow. No one ever did that. They usually washed with plain water from a bucket. Ethan explained that hot water removes what cold water doesn't, that it was a very ancient Eastern tradition. Martha snorted but took note. He cut up the chicken. His perfect physical coordination made every movement flawless. The knife followed the joints precisely, not a single unnecessary movement. Not a single second wasted. Martha watched his hands, silently, with that expression a professional gets when they see another professional. The broth simmered for 3 hours. Ethan stood at the stove, skimming off the scum. He kept an eye on the temperature. He added salt at exactly the right moment. Martha didn't leave. She stood nearby. She said nothing. When the broth was ready, Ethan poured 2 bowls, one for the Queen Mother, One for Martha. Martha tasted it. She froze. She looked at him. She said that in 22 years at the Royal, no one had ever offered her a taste first. Ethan said that a chef who doesn't taste his own food isn't a chef. Martha laughed, loudly, so the whole kitchen could hear. The junior assistant dropped his tray. Ethan took the broth to the Queen Mother. She ate slowly, 2 spoonfuls, 3, 5. Then she set her plate aside. She looked at him. Her eyes were moist. She said it reminded her of what her mother used to make, a long time ago, before she was queen, when she was just a little girl in a small castle up north. Ethan said nothing. The Queen Mother finished the broth, all of it. Her first full plate of food in 3 weeks. She fell asleep in the armchair by the fireplace. Ethan covered her with a blanket and left. He returned to the kitchen. Martha was waiting for him. She was sitting at the table, peeling vegetables. Not because she had to, because she was waiting. Ethan sat down across from her. Martha asked where he was from, not in the sense of which city, but in the sense of where he got to be the way he was. Ethan replied that he was from the workshop, that his father had been a blacksmith, that he'd learned to do things right because doing them wrong was too expensive. Martha nodded. She understood. 22 years in a stranger's kitchen. She too knew the cost of every mistake. Ethan asked her about the palace chef, the one who hadn't served him food. Martha pursed her lips. She said that Chef Victor was a good cook, but a coward. His wife was the daughter of the stablemaster Volkarov, and when she was told that her husband didn't need to feed the new prince consort, Victor didn't argue. Ethan nodded. He wasn't angry. He understood. Cowardice isn't meanness, it's fear, and fear is part of the problem. He asked Martha if she cooked only for the servants or if she could cook for the masters as well. Martha replied that she could cook for anyone, but she wasn't allowed to, because she was just a cook, not a chef. She didn't have a certificate from the Chef's Guild. Ethan asked how much the certificate cost. Martha named the price, 80 silver coins. Ethan said nothing. He had 9 silver coins left after buying the chicken, but he remembered the figure. The next day he came back. He made some broth. He took it to the Queen Mother. She ate, no longer just 2 spoonfuls, a full plate. She asked for seconds. On the 3rd day, she asked him to sit next to her and tell her a story. Ethan told her about his father's blacksmith shop, about how metal is smelted, about the sound of good steel. The Queen Mother listened. Her eyes grew brighter. Her complexion improved. She began to eat. She began to sleep. She began to leave her chambers. A week later, for the first time in a month, she appeared at dinner in the small hall. The courtiers exchanged glances. The steward turned pale. The Queen Mother sat down at the table, piece straight, with clear eyes, and she said she wanted to thank the prince consort for repairing the stove in her chambers and for caring for her health. Celeste sat at the head of the table. Ethan saw her out of the corner of his eye. She wasn't looking at him, but the corner of her lips twitched, for a second, maybe 2, almost a smile. Richard Irving was seated 3 seats away. He wasn't smiling. He looked at Ethan with the same gaze he'd had in the throne room. A promise, cold, calm, patient. After dinner, Ethan walked down the hallway toward his quarters. Around the corner, they were waiting for him. 2 of them, in palace guard uniforms. Familiar faces. Ethan had seen them at the gate. One stood on the right, the other on the left. The first said that the chief of the guard, Reynold Irving, wanted to speak with him. Ethan asked where. The first pointed to the staircase leading down, the basement. Ethan looked at the staircase. He looked at the guards. A dark staircase, the basement. 2 burly men, Richard Irving's relatives. Ethan said he would be happy to meet with the chief of the guard, tomorrow, at noon, in the small hall, in front of witnesses. The first guard stepped closer. He said that the chief of the guard wanted to speak with him right now. Ethan didn't move. He stood calmly, hands at his sides. His voice was steady. He said he would have a servant relay his reply to the chief guard, and that he was certain Reynold Irving was a man of honor and would not insist on a private meeting when the prince consort was politely offering a public one. The first guard stood there. He watched. Ethan stood there. He watched. 3 seconds. 5. 7. The first guard stepped back. They left. Ethan made his way to his chambers. He closed the door. He sat down on the bed. His hands were shaking, slightly, almost imperceptibly. He clenched his fists. He waited. The trembling subsided. He was alive. Today, tomorrow, not guaranteed. He took out a piece of paper. He wrote a note, a short one. He addressed it to Hana Ju, the head of the princess's personal security detail. The message was simple. He was asking for a meeting, 5 minutes, whenever it was convenient for her, regarding the princess's safety, not his safety, hers. It was important. If he'd written that someone was trying to kill him, Hana might have ignored it. She wasn't obligated to protect him. She was obligated to protect Celeste. But if the princess's safety was in question, Hana would come. Ethan sent the note with Thomas. He waited. An hour later, Thomas returned. The reply was verbal. Hana Ju was waiting for him in the training yard in 20 minutes. Ethan went there. The training yard was empty, a sandy area, wooden dummies, racks with training weapons, and a single figure by the far wall. Hana Ju, 22 years old, dark hair pulled back, a scar across her left eyebrow, dark skin, black eyes, expressionless. She stood with her arms crossed and looked at him the same way Irving had looked at him in the throne room. Right through him. Ethan approached. He bowed. Hana did not bow. She said curtly, "Speak." Ethan said, "The chief of the guard, Reynold Irving, is Richard Irving's cousin. The guards who protect the palace report to him. The princess lives in the palace guarded by a man of the Irvings." That was all he wanted to say. Hana was silent. Her expression didn't change. Her eyes didn't change. But something in the air around her grew heavier. She asked how he knew. Ethan replied that he had been listening, and that he knew how to listen. Hana looked at him for another 10 seconds. Then she nodded, briefly. She turned around. She left. No thank you. No goodbye. No promises. Ethan stood in the empty courtyard. He didn't know if she'd heard him. He didn't know if it would help. He didn't know anything. Except one thing. He'd made a move. A small one. The right one. And now he had to wait. On the 10th day, Ethan received a talent that changed everything. Daily talent received. Perfect reading of micro-expressions. Rank SSS. Valid for 24 hours. He was sitting at breakfast in the small hall. Tea from the Queen Mother's maid. Bread bought at the market. And the world around him suddenly became transparent. Every face in the hall turned into an open book. The servant by the door, tension at the corners of his mouth. Fear, not of Ethan, of someone standing behind the door. Ethan glanced sideways. No one was visible behind the door, but the servant was afraid. The junior cook carrying a dish to the table. The muscle under his left eye twitched when he looked at Ethan. Disgust, fleeting, suppressed, professional. This man hated him personally, not on orders, out of conviction. The Queen Mother's maid. Her pupils dilated as she set down the tea. Interest. She wasn't just watching him on orders. She was curious. Ethan drank his tea and read the room like a newspaper. Every gesture, every glance, every micro movement of the facial muscles that people don't control or even realize. 24 hours. He had to use them wisely. An hour after breakfast, Thomas arrived. Pale. His hands were shaking. He said that Richard Irving had issued a formal demand for satisfaction. A duel. In the presence of the court. In 20 days. The day before the wedding. Ethan looked at Thomas. He read his face. Fear. But not only that. Pity. Thomas pitied him. He was certain Ethan would die. Ethan asked if he could refuse. Thomas said that, technically, yes, but refusing a duel meant a public admission of cowardice. The council could use this as grounds for annulling the marriage. A trap. Agree, and you'll die in the arena. Refuse, and you'll lose Celeste. You'll lose everything. Ethan thanked Thomas. He dismissed him. He sat down at the table. 20 days. Richard Irving, rank SS. A fighter since childhood. The best teachers, the best weapons, the best technique. Ethan, rank F. A former laborer and clerk. Zero chance in a fair fight, but a fair fight is the condition Irving chose. Ethan isn't obligated to play by his rules. He has to find his own. Ethan stood up and walked over to Magnus. The armory, the familiar smell of oil and metal. Magnus was polishing a blade, that very one, the 27th. The sword his father had forged 50 years ago. Ethan sat down at the workbench and told him about the duel. Magnus wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting this. The old man set down the sword and asked what Ethan was going to do. Ethan said he didn't know yet. But he had 20 days and one question. What were the rules of the duel? Magnus explained. A duel to first blood or until one falls, not to the death. Both opponents choose their weapons. The contest takes place in a fenced arena. 3 judges chosen from among the courtiers. Magic above rank A is prohibited. Ethan latched on to that last point. Magic above rank A is prohibited. Irving is rank SS. That means Irving can't use his full strength. It's a limitation, a small one, but a real one. Magnus shook his head. He said that Irving doesn't need magic. His fencing is already at rank A level on its own. He'll defeat any swordsman in the lift with pure technique. Ethan nodded. He wasn't planning to win the fencing match. He was planning not to lose. Those are two different things. Ethan spent the next 2 hours in the training courtyard, alone, with a wooden sword. He wasn't practicing attacks. He was practicing his footwork. Step back, step to the side, a parry, a turn, distance. His perfect body coordination had vanished 3 days ago, but his ability to read micro-expressions was still there. And Ethan realized one thing. A fencer thinks before striking. He thinks with his body. The facial muscles react a fraction of a second before the hand moves. A clenched jaw, narrowed eyes, a shift in gaze. If he could read Irving, he could predict his strike, not block it, dodge it. It was a chance. A slim one, but a chance. That evening, Ethan went to the small hall. Dinner. The first dinner he'd been allowed to attend. Not because the rules had changed, because the Queen Mother had personally demanded it. The hall was full, 30 people. Celeste at the head of the table. To her left, Hana Ju, standing behind her, not sitting. Security doesn't eat with the gentlemen. Ethan entered. The hall fell silent for a second. Then whispers. He heard every word because he was reading their lips as well as their expressions. Someone whispered that they were surprised he was still alive. Someone whispered that after the duel, the problem would resolve itself. Someone whispered that the princess had made a mistake. Ethan walked to his seat. It was at the far end of the table, the very last seat, after all the lords and ladies, even after the junior treasurer. Protocol. Until his wedding, the prince consort holds no rank at court. He sat down. Across from him sat a young woman, 18 years old, blonde hair, blonde eyes, a book tucked under her elbow. On the table in front of her lay a notebook filled with numbers. She was writing something in small, precise handwriting. Ethan read her face. Anxiety. Constant. Ever present. Not fear. A burden. This girl was carrying something heavy. Every day, every minute. And no one saw it because she was smiling. Broadly, brightly, sunlit, falsely. Ethan recognized her. Lillian Haynes. The youngest daughter of the disgraced House of Haynes, Celeste's lady-in-waiting. Her father was in prison for debts, 3 brothers under house arrest. The family estate on the brink of ruin, and Lillian sat at the table, smiling, jotting down numbers in her notebook and pretending everything was fine. Ethan glanced at her notebook. Not on purpose, by accident. Numbers, columns, totals. She was calculating expenses. The palace's expenses, not her own, public funds. She was keeping a parallel ledger of the palace's finances in a small notebook over dinner. Why? Ethan didn't know, but he saw her handwriting. Neat, precise. Not a single mistake in the calculations. He scanned the 3 columns at a glance. Perfect. Lillian looked up. She caught his gaze. She smiled. That same fake, sunny smile. She asked how he was liking the palace. Ethan read her face behind the smile. Curiosity, genuine. She wanted to know who he was. Not for the houses, for herself. Ethan replied that the palace was interesting, and that her calculations for the 3rd column were correct, but there was an error of 8,000 silver pieces in the government budget for the 4th quarter. He'd seen that budget 2 days ago when the Queen Mother showed him the papers. An overpayment on the grain contract. The very same one he'd calculated back when he was still a clerk at the notary's office. Lillian froze. Her smile vanished. For the first time, her face showed a genuine expression. Shock. She whispered, 8,000? Ethan explained quietly. The contract to supply grain to the court had been signed 4 years ago. The price was fixed. But the market price of grain had fallen twice during that time. The court continued to pay the old price. The difference was 8,000 silver coins a year. Over 4 years, that came to 32,000. Someone was pocketing that difference. Lillian stared at him. Her eyes were wide. She'd forgotten her notebook. Then she quickly lowered her head. She opened the notebook. She began to count. Her fingers raced across the lines. Her lips moved silently. A minute later, she raised her head. Her face was pale. She'd found it. Ethan saw more than just shock on her face. He saw delight. The kind of delight a person feels when, for the first time in their life, they're allowed to do what they do best. Ethan quietly said that if Lady Haynes was interested, he had a few more observations regarding government expenditures that he'd like to discuss. Lillian blushed, all the way to the roots of her hair. She nodded quickly, 3 times, and again she hid her face in her notebook. After dinner, Ethan was walking to his quarters. Hannah Ju was waiting for him in the hallway. She was standing against the wall. Her arms were crossed. Her face was stony. Ethan stopped. He read her expression. For the first time that day, he saw something he couldn't fully decipher. Hannah controlled her muscles almost perfectly. Almost. One detail, a tiny twitch around her eyes. Not anger, not contempt. Assessment. She was assessing him. Hannah said she'd verified his information about Reynold Irving, that he was right, that she'd taken action. She didn't say exactly what those measures were. Ethan didn't ask. Hannah was silent for a moment. Then she said the duel would take place in 20 days, and that she wouldn't interfere. It wasn't her business. Her business was the princess. Ethan nodded. He wasn't expecting any help. Hannah turned to leave. She stopped. Without turning around, she said that Irving strikes with his right, always with his right. He starts with an overhead swing and transitions to a horizontal swing on the second strike. That's all she'll say. And she left. Ethan stood in the hallway. It was more than he'd expected. Not help, not an alliance. A crack. A small crack in the wall between him and the man who had sworn to protect his wife. That was enough for now. He returned to his quarters. He sat down at the table. His ability to read micro-expressions was still working. There were 6 hours left until dawn. A covert mission, he thought. What does perfect micro-expression reading mean? What kind of mission could be tied to this talent? To read someone important, to see what no one else sees, to understand what no one else understands. He ran through all the faces he'd seen today in his mind. Servants, guards, courtiers, Lillian, Hannah, Martha, Magnus. He caught a glimpse of Celeste across the entire hall, too far away to read. Ethan froze. Celeste. Not once in 10 days had he spoken with her alone. She'd chosen him, made him her husband, and vanished behind the wall of protocol. Morning councils, evening receptions, meetings with ambassadors. She was right there and yet 1,000 miles away. Ethan stood up, left his chambers, walked down the hallway. The palace was quiet at night. Guards at the turns. Different guards, not the Irvings, Hannah's. Ethan noticed the difference. New faces, silent, alert. Hannah worked quickly. He was heading toward the princess's chambers. 2 guards at the door, Hani's men. They looked at him. One nodded. They let him through. Ethan knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened. Celeste stood in the doorway, without her crown, without her silver dress, a simple white shirt, her hair down, barefoot, her eyes tired. She looked at him. He read her face, and he gasped. Not because of her beauty, because of the pain. There was so much pain on her face that he physically felt pressure in his chest. Exhaustion, loneliness, fear, guilt. She felt guilty for choosing him, for putting him in danger, for the fact that he might die in 20 days because of her decision. She had lived with that guilt for 10 days, in silence, behind a wall of icy composure. Ethan stood in the doorway. Celeste stood before him. He didn't know what to say. He was an engineer, not a poet. He said one thing, that he wouldn't die, that he had a plan, that she didn't need to fear for him. Celeste looked at him. Her lips twitched, a micro-movement. She wanted to say something. She held it back. Then she replied quietly that she wasn't afraid, that she was a queen, and queens aren't afraid. Ethan read the lie on her face as clearly as he read cracks in metal. He didn't argue. He bowed. He wished her good night. He turned around. He walked down the hallway, a secret mission, to see the truth on the queen's face. A warmth spread through his chest. Briefly. A quiet chime. A talent preserved forever. 2 out of 2. For the next 18 days, Ethan prepared for the duel. Every morning at dawn, he received a new talent. Every evening, the talent faded away. He kept only 2, an absolute ear for metal, and the ability to read micro-expressions. Everything else was temporary. On the 11th day, he received accelerated healing. Ethan spent the day in the training yard, letting Magnus strike him with a wooden sword over and over again. Every bruise healed in minutes. He wasn't training his technique, he was training his body to endure the blows, to get used to the pain, not to flinch. The talent at dawn and the bruises returned to normal, but his muscle memory remained as well. On the 12th day, he gained night vision. Useless for a duel. Ethan spent the night wandering through the palace in the dark, studying every corridor, every staircase, every hidden turn. On the 13th day, he gained perfect memory. It was a gift. Ethan sat down in the palace library that morning and read until sunset. 17 books. Aurelian's military tactics, the rules of the dueling code, the history of the great houses, the kingdom's trade laws, mining and mana extraction. Every page was etched into his mind forever. The talent faded at dawn, but the knowledge remained. He had failed to complete the hidden task. He didn't understand what it was. Maybe he was supposed to memorize something specific. Maybe read a certain book. He hadn't guessed correctly. It hurt. An SSS rank perfect memory. Lost. Ethan didn't allow himself to feel sorry for himself. The task's condition? To move forward. Every day he trained with Magnus. The old man wasn't a fencer, but he was a blacksmith. He knew how the body moves with a sword. He knew the center of gravity. He knew balance. He taught Ethan not to strike, but to move. A step, half a step, a quarter step. Weight on the front leg, weight on the back leg, twist the torso. Every day after practice, Ethan went to the kitchen. He made broth for the Queen Mother. Martha helped, silently. She no longer asked where he came from. She simply stood beside him, chopping vegetables, passing him the salt at just the right moment, and taking the pot away when he was done. It was a partnership. Quiet, practical, real. Every evening he had dinner in the small dining room. Lillian sat across from him. The numbers on her notepad kept growing. After the third dinner, she slipped him a note under the table, neat handwriting, 4 lines of numbers. She'd found a second error in the government budget. Not 8,000, 12. An additional 4,000 went through a contract for fabrics for the palace wardrobe. The supplier was the same person as for the grain, connected to the House of Castle. Ethan read the note. He burned it in the fireplace. He memorized the numbers. On the 15th day, he asked Lillian for a meeting. She came to the library, nervous, her fingers fiddled with the spine of a book. Ethan sat down across from her. He looked at her, without any talent for reading micro-expressions, with his ordinary eyes. But even with ordinary eyes, he could see. A girl who could count better than any treasurer and who had been told her whole life that numbers weren't for her. Ethan said he needed someone to handle the financial records for his future workshop, that he planned to open a blacksmith shop at the Eastern Gate, that he needed a chief accountant, that he wanted to offer her the position. Lillian opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, asked why her. Ethan replied that it was because she had found an error amounting to 12,000 silver pieces that the regular treasurer hadn't found in 4 years, and that it was the best resume he'd ever seen. Lillian blushed, dropped the book, picked it up. She dropped it again. Ethan picked up the book and placed it on the table. Lillian said she accepted. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. On the 16th day, Ethan met Darius Castle for the first time. Not of his own volition. Castle came on his own, in the morning, to the prince consort's chambers, without an invitation, without knocking. He just walked in. Handsome, dark hair, a smile. Ethan was sitting at the table. Castle sat down across from him as if he were at home. He spoke easily, at ease. He said he wanted to offer friendship, that the House of Castle was no enemy, that Irving was everyone's enemy, and that smart people should unite against a common threat. Ethan listened. He didn't have the knack for reading micro-expressions right then, but he had knowledge. The Queen Mother had said that Castle was sending spies to find compromising evidence. Lillian had discovered that money from government contracts was flowing to Castle's people. Castle was offering friendship with one hand and digging his own grave with the other. Ethan smiled. He thanked him for the visit. He said he appreciated the offer, that he'd think about it, that he'd be happy to continue the conversation after the wedding. Castle smiled back. They both knew they were both lying, but the rules of the game demanded smiles. Castle left. Ethan sat down and wrote down everything Castle had said. Every word, every gesture, every pause. Castle was more dangerous than Irving. Irving struck straight on. Castle struck from around the corner. On the 18th day, Ethan made his decision about the duel. He couldn't defeat Irving in a fencing. He couldn't, and he shouldn't. The rules said first blood or until one fell. First blood. Even a scratch. If Irving cut him, it's over. Falling. If either of them fell, it's over. Ethan had to prevent Irving from cutting him while also forcing Irving to fall. No magic, no power. Without fencing technique, which he didn't have. Hana said Irving strikes with his right, an overhead thrust. Transitioning to a horizontal thrust on the second strike. Ethan had been practicing one move, just one, for 18 days. A step to the left at the moment of the overhead thrust, half a step back during the horizontal thrust, and a counter step forward when Irving passes by on momentum. Not a strike, a trip, a simple one. A low one, the kind of trip boys pull on the street. Magnus looked at his plan. He shook his head. He said it was madness, that Irving was an experienced fighter and wouldn't rely on momentum. Ethan replied that he would, because Irving despises him, because Irving is sure he's facing an empty space, because Irving won't hold back against an F-rank opponent. He'll put all his strength into the first strike, all his weight, all his rage, and when the blow misses, momentum will carry him forward. Half a step. For a second, that will be enough. Magnus was silent. Then he said quietly that if it wasn't enough, Ethan would die. Ethan nodded. He knew. On the 19th day, he went to see the Queen Mother. She was already eating on her own. Every day, full portions. She'd get up, walk around the room, go out into the garden. The court physicians didn't understand what had happened. A miracle? No. Chicken broth and clean hands. Ethan sat down next to her by the fireplace. He said the duel was tomorrow, that he wanted to ask her for one thing. If he lost, if Irving killed him in violation of the rules, he wanted her to take care of 3 people, Magnus Hall, Martha, and Lillian Haynes. They had helped him. If he were gone, they might be punished for it. The Queen Mother listened. Her face was calm. Her eyes were moist. She said he wouldn't die. Ethan replied that he didn't plan to die, but engineers always anticipate system failure. The Queen Mother laughed softly, for the first time in his presence, a short, dry laugh. She said it was impossible to feel sorry for him, that he spoke of his own death as if it were a broken stove, and that she would take care of things, if necessary. Ethan bowed. He thanked her. He left. Hana was waiting for him in the hallway. She was standing against the wall, her face stony. She said one word, "Ready." Ethan replied that he was ready. Hana nodded, turned around, left. And Ethan saw something he hadn't seen before, even without the ability to read micro-expressions. Because some things don't need to be read on a face. They're visible in the way someone walks. Hana was walking a little slower than usual, by half a step. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to say something else. She didn't. Ethan returned to his quarters. He lay down. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow was the duel, the day of the duel. Talent at dawn. Daily talent received. A bloodhound's sense of smell. Rank SSS. Valid for 24 hours. Ethan sat up in bed. A bloodhound's sense of smell. Not what he wanted. He wanted something useful in battle. Enhanced reflexes. Time slowdown. At least coordination again. Instead, his nose. The world crashed down on him with smells. Thousands, tens of thousands. The stone walls smelled of dampness and mold from the basement. The wood of the bed smelled of wax and the sweat of its past owners. The blankets smelled of lavender from the wash and iron from the water. Thomas was standing outside the door. Ethan knew because he could smell his soap. Cheap, alkaline, with a scent of talcum powder. Ethan stood up, got dressed, opened the door. Thomas was standing there with a tray, tea, bread, and a note. Ethan took the note, unfolded it. The paper smelled of the Royal Chancery and calamus ink. Celeste's handwriting. He'd seen it once on a document from the Queen Mother. Celeste wrote that she believed in him. 3 words. I believe in you. No signature, no seal. Personal. Ethan folded the note, put it in his doublet pocket. He ate breakfast, went to the training courtyard. Magnus was waiting. In his hands he held that very blade, the 27th, his father's sword. Polished, sharpened, with a new dark leather hilt. Magnus held out the sword. Ethan took it. Light, balanced, resonant. Even without the gift of perfect pitch, Ethan could feel its harmony. This sword was perfect. Magnus said he wasn't going to wish him luck, that luck was for those who weren't ready, and Ethan was ready. Ethan nodded. The arena had been set up in the palace's central courtyard, a sandy area 20 by 20 paces, a fence made of wooden barriers, grandstands on 3 sides. The 4th side was open toward the palace gates, symbolically. The loser leaves through the gates, out of the palace, out of the princess's life. The entire court was there, 300 people, lords, ladies, advisors, ambassadors, merchants, servants tiptoeing behind the stands. Celesta sat in the central grandstand, in a white dress, a crown on her head, her face impassive. Next to her was Khan Ju, standing behind her right shoulder, his hand on the hilt of his sword. The Queen Mother sat to Celesta's left, upright, pale, but present. Lillian stood behind Celesta in a row of rails. Her notebook was hidden, her hands were clenched, her lips were pressed together. Ethan stepped into the arena, a sword in his right hand. The widow Karen's doublet, that very one, with a patch on the elbow. He chose not to wear armor. Armor would slow him down, and he needed every fraction of a second. Richard Irving entered from the other side, a white dueling uniform, gold epaulets, light leather armor. His sword was longer and heavier than Ethan's. Beautiful, expensive, unnecessary. Irving didn't need a good sword. Irving himself was a weapon. He walked across the sand with confidence, calmly, with a slight smile. He knew he would win. The entire hall knew it. 3 judges took their positions, 2 at the barriers, 1 in the center. The chief judge raised his hand. He announced the rules. First blood or until one falls. Magic above rank A is prohibited. The use of forbidden magic means defeat and expulsion from the court. Both opponents nodded. The chief judge stepped back. He raised his handkerchief. Ethan stood there, sword lowered, relaxed. His breathing was steady. He looked at Irving, not at his sword, at his face. Micro-expressions, a well-honed talent. It always worked. Irving's face said it all. Contempt, confidence, impatience. He wanted to finish quickly, to make a point, to humiliate and walk away. The handkerchief fell. Irving stepped forward, quickly. 3 steps, sword raised, an overhead swing, exactly as Hannah had said. Ethan read his face. His jaw clenched a split second before the strike. His eyes narrowed slightly. A muscle in his neck tensed. The strike came, from top to bottom, heavy, fast, with his full weight behind it. Ethan stepped to the left. Irving's blade swept past his right shoulder. Sand sprayed from the strike into thin air. The stands gasped. Irving didn't stop. A second strike, horizontal, from left to right, just as Hannah had said. Ethan took half a step back. The blade swept past his chest. The wind from the blade ruffled the fabric of his doublet. His bloodhound's sense of smell was working. Ethan could smell Irving. Sweat, metal, anger. Anger smelled sour, sharp. Irving spun around. His expression changed. The contempt was gone. Surprise appeared. Brief, fleeting, and irritation. The third strike, diagonal, from bottom to top. Khan hadn't mentioned that. Ethan read the strike on Irving's face a second before he began his movement. A shift of weight to his right leg, a twist of the torso, a tilt of the head. His body gave away every strike before his hands even began to move. Ethan stepped aside. The third strike whizzed past. Irving stopped. He stood there, watching. 3 punches. 3 misses, into thin air, at a mediocrity. At an F-rank piece of trash, the stands were silent. Irving attacked again, faster, more ferociously, a four-punch combination. Ethan dodged each one. A step to the left, a step to the right, half a step back. A lean. He didn't parry. He didn't block. He had neither the strength nor the technique for that. He simply didn't stand where the blade was coming. Irving growled, quietly, through clenched teeth. His face was red. The stench of rage grew stronger. Acid and iron. The fifth strike, the sixth, the seventh. Ethan kept dodging, each time by a hair's breadth, each time by reading his opponent's face. Irving was putting more and more power into his strikes, more and more weight, more and more rage, and every swing that missed carried him forward just a little farther than he needed to go. Half a step, a quarter of a step, the momentum built. The eighth strike, an overhead swing, full force. Ethan read it in a split second. Jaw, eyes, neck, shoulder. The blow came. Ethan stepped to the left. Irving swept past him. He'd given it his all. The blade sank into the sand. Irving was carried forward. Half a step, a full step. Ethan took a counter step. One movement, simple, low, a foot forward, across, a street kid's trip. Irving stumbled. His weight did the rest. 90 kilograms plus a heavy sword plus the momentum of the swing. Richard Irving, SS rank heir to the great house of Irving, fell face first into the sand. The arena. 300 witnesses. The princess in the stands. Silence. The kind of silence that falls when the world turns upside down and no one has yet realized what has happened. Irving lay in the sand. 1 second. 2. 3. He got up. Slowly. Sand on his face, on his white uniform, on his gold epaulettes. Eyes. Ethan saw his eyes, and in them there was no longer any contempt, surprise, or irritation. Hatred. Pure. Concentrated. Forever. The chief judge raised his hand. Knockdown. Victory for the prince consort. Ethan stood in the arena, sword lowered, breathless. His legs were shaking. He could barely stand, but he stood. The stands were silent for another 3 seconds. Then someone clapped. One person. Ethan looked. The Queen Mother. She sat upright and clapped. Slowly, calmly, with a slight smile. Then a second person clapped. A third. A minute later, half the arena was applauding. Not for the victory, for the spectacle, for the impossible, for the fact that a mediocrity had stood his ground against the kingdom's best fighter and knocked him to the sand with a kick. The other half of the arena was silent, and they looked at Ethan just as Irving did. Irving turned around. He walked off the arena. He didn't bow. He didn't offer congratulations. He just left, through the gates, symbolically. Ethan stood in the arena. He turned his head toward the stands. His eyes found Celeste. She sat motionless. Her face was icy, the queen, but her hands lay on her knees, and her fingers were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Just like in the throne room, when she was afraid he would say no. Ethan bowed to her, deeply, as befits a husband, as befits a consort. Celeste tilted her head slightly, just 1 millimeter, an acknowledgement. Ethan left the arena. The wedding took place the next day, quiet, quick, without fanfare. That was what Celeste herself wanted. A priest, 2 witnesses, Hannah Jew and Magnus Hall, 4 words of the vow. Ethan spoke them while looking Celeste in the eyes. She spoke them while looking him in the eyes. The rings were simple. Silver. Ethan had chosen them himself. Not gold, not gemstones. Silver because silver is honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. Celeste looked at the ring on her finger. Her expression didn't change, but Ethan noticed a subtle twitch of the muscle near her left eye. Surprise. A warm kind of surprise. She hadn't expected it. That he'd choose silver. What he'd think of it. What he would think at all. After the ceremony, the two of them sat down at a table together, for the first time. A small room behind the throne room. 2 chairs. Tea. Silence. Celeste was silent. Ethan was silent. The silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was just 2 people sitting side by side in silence, and that was normal. 5 minutes later, Celeste said that he was now the prince consort, officially, with access to the council, the treasury, and the royal seal. Ethan nodded. He said he had a plan. Celeste raised an eyebrow. He explained. Not everything, just the essentials. Crane's workshop, a blacksmith shop by the eastern gate. Standardized forging. Higher quality than the court's master craftsman.
lower price.
Jobs for people no one else will hire. Rank F. The disabled, orphans, the elderly, people who know how to work with their hands but aren't given the chance. Celeste listened. Her face was impassive, but Ethan saw it. Interest. Genuine, not just for show. She asked how much money he needed. Ethan named a figure. 200 silver. Rent for the space. Materials. Tools. The first month's wages. Celeste said it was a laughable sum. That the House of Irving spends 200 silver on a single banquet. Ethan replied that that was exactly why he would defeat the House of Irving. Because he knows how to get things done for 200 silver coins where they spend 200,000. Celeste looked at him for a long time. Then the corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. She said the money would be ready tomorrow. Ethan bowed. He stood up. He walked toward the door. Celeste called out to him. He turned around. She was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in her hands, a silver ring on her finger. She said quietly that he'd been reckless in the duel, that she forbade him to die without her permission, that this was an order. Ethan replied that he took note of it. He left. 2 days later, Crane's workshop opened. The space was near the eastern gate, a former stable, spacious, stone walls, a roof that Ethan patched up himself on the very first day. 2 forges, 3 anvils, workbenches along the walls, tools partly purchased and partly borrowed from Magnus from the palace's stockpile. The first employees: Magnus Hall, master, chief blacksmith, 4 apprentices, all rank F, all from poor backgrounds, all came because no one else would take them. Ethan gathered them together on the first morning. He stood before them, 4 young men between the ages of 16 and 22, skinny, nervous, used to being yelled at. Ethan said 3 things. First, the workday is 8 hours, not 12, not 14, 8. A tired worker makes defects. Defects cost money. Money costs time. So rest isn't laziness, it's a production necessity. Second, everyone will study. 30 minutes a day for training, reading, arithmetic, the basics of metallurgy. Anyone who can't read will learn to. Third, everyone gets a salary. 5 silver coins a month, plus a share of the profits when there are profits. The 4 apprentices looked at him. 5 silver coins was more than they'd ever earned. An 8-hour workday was unheard of. Training paid for by the employer was impossible. One of them, a guy named Greg, asked what the catch was. Ethan replied that the catch was quality. He would demand a level of quality they'd never achieved before. Every product must meet the standard, every measurement, every item inspected. Not a single nail without tolerance, not a single horseshoe without inspection. It would be difficult, but they would learn. Greg looked at the others. They nodded. Martha came on her own, on the second day, with pots and pans, with a supply of onions and garlic. She said she would cook lunch, that she was still the palace cook and worked there during the day, but her evenings and mornings were free, and that if the prince consort thinks his workers will be eating dry bread as long as she's alive, then he doesn't know her very well. Ethan didn't argue. Lillian arrived on the third day, with a notebook, a new notebook, a thick one, a blank one. She sat down at the table in the corner of the workshop and began taking notes. Expenses, income, material balances, employee rosters, delivery schedules. She calculated faster than Ethan had expected. Every number was in its place. Every column was perfect. Ethan looked at her and saw a person who had found her place, for the first time in her life. For the first week, Crane's workshop produced nails, ordinary nails, staples, hinges, simple items needed by every home, every shop, every workshop in the city. But Ethan made them differently. He wrote out the technical process, on paper. Step 1. Heat the blank to a light red glow. Not dark red, not orange, light red. Step 2. Forge with 25 blows, rotating the blank a quarter turn after every 5th blow. Step 3. Quench in oil, not in water, in oil. Slower, gentler, no microcracks. Every apprentice received this technical process. Each one memorized it. Each one followed it exactly. The result? Crane Workshop's nails didn't bend. Ordinary nails bent after a month. Crane's lasted a year. The price was the same. The quality was 3 times better. In the first week, they sold 300 nails, 2 gate staples, a set of hinges for a carpenter. Revenue, 14 silver coins. Expenses, 9 silver coins. Profit, 5 silver coins. A laughable amount, but a positive one, right from the first week. Ethan looked at the numbers in Lillian's notebook. 5 silver coins in profit for the first week, 200 silver coins in debt to the treasury, 40 weeks until break-even. Unless he expanded. He was going to expand. In the second week, one of the carpenters who had bought the hinges came back. He brought a friend. The friend looked at the nails. He bent one. It didn't bend. He bent it harder. It still didn't bend. He bought 500 of them. He paid in advance. He asked for another batch in a week. Ethan nodded. Word got around. Slowly, quietly, like water over a rock. Crane's nails don't bend. A month after opening, Crane's workshop became a problem. Not for Ethan, for the House of Volcor. The Volcors controlled 3/4 of the capital's blacksmithing production. Their workshops stood on every street. Their mark was on every nail, every horseshoe, every lock. A monopoly built over 3 generations. And then a guy with an F rank showed up in a former stable with 4 apprentices and started making things that were better. Not just a little better, significantly better. Crane's nails didn't bend. Crane's horseshoes lasted twice as long. Crane's staples withstood loads that the Volcor staples couldn't handle, and they cost the same. Lord Volcor wasn't the first to notice this. His manager was the first to notice, a man named Rand, lean, cunning, with rat-like eyes. He came to the workshop toward the end of the 4th week, in the morning, when the forges hadn't yet heated up. Ethan was standing at the workbench inspecting a batch of hinges. Rand walked in without knocking. He looked around. He looked at the 4 apprentices. At Magnus by the forge. At Lillian at the table with her notebook. He looked at Ethan. He smiled. Ethan read his face. His latent talent was at work. Rand wasn't smiling. Rand was assessing. He was calculating. He was weighing his options. There were 3 layers to his micro-expressions. First, feigned friendliness. Second, genuine interest. Third, a threat. Rand said he had come on behalf of House Volcor, that the house was impressed by the quality of the products, that he wanted to propose a partnership. Crane's workshop would become part of the Volcor network. It would gain access to their mines, to their trade routes, to their customers. In exchange, 50% of the profits and the Volcor brand on all products. Ethan listened. His face was calm. His hands were behind his back. 50% of the profits. The Volcor mark. This isn't a partnership. It's a takeover. Crane's workshop will cease to exist. It will become a branch of Volcor. Ethan will work for them, for half of what he earns himself. Ethan thanked him for the offer. He said he'd think it over. He asked for a week. Rand nodded. He left. Magnus approached after he'd gone. He said this wasn't an offer. It was a warning. If Ethan refused, Volcor would start applying pressure. They'd cut off ore supplies, they'd intimidate customers, they'd bribe the city guard to find violations. They had the money, the people, and the power to do so. Ethan nodded. He knew. But he knew something else as well. Of the 17 books he had read on the day of absolute memory, one was about the trade laws of Aurelian. The Free Trade Act, paragraph 12. Any manufacturing operation holding a royal patent is exempt from city oversight and cannot be forced to join a guild or trade union. The royal patent, the monarch's signature, the treasury's seal. Ethan went to Celeste, the reception hall. Celeste was sitting at a table, papers, 3 advisors around her, Hannah behind her. Ethan entered. He bowed. He asked for 5 minutes. The advisors exchanged glances. Celeste nodded. They left. Ethan explained, briefly. Understood. Crane's workshop produces better products than Volcor. Volcor wants to take over the workshop. If it does, Volcor's control over the blacksmithing market will become absolute. Prices will rise. Quality will decline. The treasury will lose money. Solution: a royal patent for Crane's workshop, protection against pressure, free competition. Celeste listened. Her face was impassive. Then she asked what she would get in return. Not as a wife, as a queen. Ethan replied, 10% of the workshop's profits to the treasury every month, plus priority fulfillment of the crown's orders, plus training 20 new craftsmen a year from among the city's poor. Jobs, taxes, the loyalty of those whom the houses consider trash. Celeste was silent for 10 seconds. Then she took out a blank sheet of paper. She wrote out the patent. She affixed her seal. She handed it to him, without a word. Ethan took the patent. He bowed. He walked toward the door. Celeste called after him that Volker would not forgive him. Ethan replied that he knew. 3 days later, Rand came for an answer. Ethan showed him the patent, the royal seal, the princess's signature. Rand read it. His expression didn't change, but Ethan saw a subtle twitch, a jaw muscle, a clench, anger. Rand bowed. He left. In silence. A week later, the problems began. The first one, the ore supplier refused to sell to Crane's workshop. He apologized. He said he'd received a more lucrative contract and couldn't fulfill both. The contract was from Volcor. They'd poached his supplier. Ethan found another one, more expensive, 2 silver pieces per cartload. Profits dropped. Second, 3 customers stopped coming. The carpenter who used to buy 500 nails, the blacksmith from the next street who ordered blanks, the carriage maker who raved about the hinges. All 3 suddenly stopped coming. Ethan asked Greg. Greg replied that he'd overheard a conversation at the market. Someone said it was dangerous to buy from Crane, that the Volcors would remember everyone who went to him. The third one. At night, someone threw a stone at the workshop window. The glass shattered. The stone was wrapped in a rag. The Volcor emblem was drawn on the rag. Ethan stood by the broken window that morning. Shards lay on the floor. The apprentices were silent. Lillian stood with a notebook. Her hands didn't tremble. She had already grown accustomed to the pressure. Her entire house had been living under pressure for years. Magnus approached. He said they needed security, that someone might have set the place on fire at night instead of just throwing a stone. Ethan agreed. But security cost money he didn't have. That evening, he went to the Queen Mother's chambers. He sat by the fireplace. He explained the situation. He didn't complain. He stated the facts. Volcor was putting pressure on them. Suppliers were leaving. Customers were afraid. The window was broken. The Queen Mother listened. Then she said one thing, that Crane's workshop was the first thing in 10 years to truly threaten Volcor's monopoly, and that Volcor understood this, and that if Ethan could withstand the pressure for the first 3 months, Volcor would start to get nervous. Because a nervous Volcor makes mistakes, and mistakes are opportunities. Ethan nodded. 3 months. He had to hold out for 3 months. The next morning, the talent was a gift. Daily talent received. The artisan's voice. Rank SSS. Valid for 24 hours. Ethan didn't know what that meant until he opened his mouth. He went to the market. He approached an ore supplier, not the one who'd turned him down. A new one, a young one, a nervous one. One who charged more because he was afraid of the Wolf Kings. Ethan spoke, and his voice did something strange. It didn't get louder. It didn't sound more beautiful. It became persuasive. Every word landed exactly where it needed to. Every pause was perfect. Every argument was laid out like a brick in a wall. Ethan explained, calmly, quietly, with the kind of politeness that breaks down resistance. He explained that working with Crane's workshop was profitable, that the royal patent protected everyone associated with them, that Volcor wouldn't touch a supplier to the crown, that the price for silver could be lower than the current one and the supplier would still earn more than with Volcor because Crane pays on time and doesn't demand kickbacks. The supplier listened. His expression changed. Fear faded. Calculation set in. 20 minutes later, they shook hands. The price for silver was lower than before. Weekly deliveries. Ethan moved on. To the carpenter who had stopped buying nails. To the carriage maker. To the blacksmith. He spoke to each one. Quietly, politely, persuasively. The craftsman's voice didn't force people to do what they didn't want to do. He helped them see what they wanted but were afraid of. Ethan told each of them the same thing. That fear is a tax you pay to those who don't protect you. That Volcor takes their money and gives them nothing but threats. That Crane offers quality, a fair price, and patent protection. By evening, 5 had returned. 5 of the lost clients. 2 were missing. They were too afraid. Ethan didn't push them. 2 was data, too. He memorized their faces. The hidden task of the day, Ethan thought. The craftsman's voice. What needed to be done? To convince someone important. Not a client. Not a supplier. Someone who matters. That evening, he came to the workshop. The apprentices were finishing their shift. Greg was standing by the furnace. His face was somber. He worked well, diligently, exactly according to the technical process. But his face bore an expression Ethan saw every day. Uncertainty. Greg didn't believe he could succeed, that he, an F rank, could become a true master, that Ethan wouldn't kick him out once he found someone better. Ethan walked over. He stood beside him. He looked at the batch of horseshoes Greg was finishing. He picked one up. A tap with his fingernail. An absolute ear for metal. A skill preserved forever. The sound was clear, even. Good work. Very good. Ethan told Greg that. Not just good work. He said this horseshoe was better than what they made in the Volcor workshops. That in a year, Greg would be forging at a master's level. That an F rank is a mark a priest gives once in a lifetime. But mastery is what you build every day with every blow of the hammer. The craftsman's voice carried weight. Every word rang true. Because it was true. Greg stood there, listening, not moving. Then he quietly said that no one had ever told him before that he did good work. Never. Not once in his life. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, for a second, then withdrew it. Greg turned away toward the forge, quickly, so no one would see his face. Ethan's chest grew warm. A brief flash, a quiet ringing, a talent saved forever. The voice of a craftsman. 3 out of 3. 3 talents saved in the first month. Ethan walked home through the capital's evening streets, past the streetlights, past the closed shops, past a city guard patrol that nodded to him because they recognized him. The prince consort, the princess's husband, the talentless one, the one who dropped Irving into the sand, the one who makes broth for the queen mother, the one who opened a smithy for trash. Ethan walked and thought. He had 3 talents, an absolute ear for metal, reading micro-expressions, the voice of a craftsman. 3 tools, plus the mind of an engineer, plus knowledge from 17 books, plus 4 allies, Magnus, Martha, Lillian, and the Queen Mother, plus 1 crack in the wall named Hana Ju, plus a wife who believes in him, for a reason he still doesn't understand. Against him are the 4 great houses, the empire across the river, a court full of people who want him dead, and an F rank, forever. Ethan smiled, for the first time in a month, quietly, all by himself. Incomplete data, minimal resources, enemies are numerous. The mission remains the same. Survive, grow, win. He was walking home. Toward the end of the second month, Crane's workshop received its first major order. The city council ordered 400 clamps to repair the eastern bridge. The contract was for 40 silver coins. Previously, such orders had gone to Volcor without a bid. Now the council saw that Crane did better work at a lower cost. And for the first time in 10 years, they held an open bidding process. Ethan won one. Lillian had prepared the documents overnight. Every number was in place. Every line had been checked. She brought them in that morning and set them down in front of Ethan with a look on her face as if she'd won a war. Ethan signed them. He affixed the workshop seal, a new one. Magnus had forged it himself, a hammer and anvil against the backdrop of the rising sun. Simple, honest. Greg and the other apprentices worked 10 days straight. 8 hours a day, not a minute more. Ethan kept an eye on them. A tired worker makes mistakes. A mistake on a bridge means the bridge collapses. A collapsed bridge means people die. 400 staples were ready on the 9th day. Each one was personally inspected by Ethan, an absolute ear for metal. A tap on each one, a clear sound, not a single defect. The city accepted the order. They paid. The council foreman inspected the clamps and said that in 30 years of service, he had never seen such quality on city contracts. Word spread, quietly, like a stone, like water. Volcor responded on the 3rd day after the order was delivered, not through manager Rand, personally. Marcus Volcor, the Lord's son, 21 years old, rank A. He arrived at the workshop at noon, alone, without an entourage, in a simple traveling cloak, broad-shouldered, silent, his eyes unmoving, the same eyes as in the throne room. Ethan stood at the workbench. He read Marcus's face. No threat, no anger, interest, genuine, cold, calculating, but genuine. Marcus looked around the workshop, at the forges, at the workbenches, at the apprentices, at the stack of finished products against the wall, at the technical process chart nailed to the board above each workstation. He asked what those sheets on the wall were. Ethan explained. The technical process, step-by-step instructions for each product, temperature, number of strikes, type of hardening, dimension tolerances, so that any apprentice could make a product of consistent quality. Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he said that in Volcor's workshops, every blacksmith works in his own way. That craftsmanship is passed down from teacher to student. That this is a tradition spanning 3 generations. Ethan replied that tradition is good, but a standard is better, because tradition dies along with the master, but a standard lives on paper. Marcus looked at him with that look Ethan was already beginning to recognize, the look of someone who sees something new and can't decide whether to fear it or learn from it. Marcus left, silently. He didn't say goodbye, but he didn't make any threats either. It was strange. Ethan remembered it. That evening, a woman appeared at the market next to the workshop. Tall, dark hair, a long, thin pipe in her hand. Tobacco smoke rose into the evening air. She stood by the fabric counter and looked at the workshop, without hiding, openly. Ethan saw her through the window. Beautiful. Haughty. In an expensive dress that looked casual but was worth more than his entire workshop. He read her face through the window. Far away, but his talent for reading micro-expressions worked even from a distance, if the light allowed it. There was something on her face that he hadn't seen on Marcus's. Boredom. Deep. Chronic. The boredom of a person who had been given nothing to do her entire life. She looked at the workshop with the same expression a hungry person uses when looking at food behind glass. Iris Volcor, the enemy's daughter. Rank SS in elemental magic. Ethan recognized her from the Queen Mother's description. A beautiful face of the House of Volcor, a weapon for negotiations and receptions. No one had ever asked what she was capable of besides being beautiful. Ethan stepped away from the window. He'd remember. Not now, not today, but soon. The next morning, the talent turned out to be the one Ethan had been waiting for 3 weeks. Daily talent received, a tracker's sense of smell. SSS rank, lasts 24 hours. For the second time, the same talent he'd had on the day of the duel. Ethan sat down on the bed. He didn't waste it on training. Today was the day he had to solve the problem that had been gnawing at him since his first night in the palace. There was a reception that evening, a grand one, in honor of the start of the trading season. All the houses, all the ambassadors, 300 guests, food, wine, dancing. Ethan was supposed to be there, as prince consort, his first time at a grand reception. He got dressed, not in Widow Karen's doublet. Celeste had sent him a new one. Dark gray, simple, no gold, no embroidery, a perfect fit. She knew his size, without asking. Ethan put on the doublet. He looked in the mirror. A different man. Not a porter, not a clerk, not a nobody. A man in fine clothes with a straight back and calm eyes. The reception began at 7 o'clock wise. The grand hall, candles, music, 300 people. The scents crashed over Ethan like a wall. His keen sense of smell transformed the hall into a symphony. Wine, perfume, sweat, candle wax, roasted meat, powder, leather, metal, and one scent that made him stop. Bitter almonds. Subtle, barely perceptible, coming from the direction of the buffet table. Bitter almonds and wine meant only one thing: poison. Ethan didn't move. He stood by the column, breathing steadily, scanning the scents. The bitter almonds were coming from one specific glass, the third from the left on the silver tray. The tray stood on the buffet table in the section that, according to protocol, was reserved for the princess's table. That glass was meant for Celeste. Ethan scanned the room. Who? 300 people. Anyone could have approached the buffet. Anyone could have dripped poison into a glass. He couldn't figure out who, but he could do something else. Ethan walked across the hall, calmly, without rushing. He approached the buffet table. He picked up the tray. All of them, 6 glasses. The servant standing nearby flinched. Ethan smiled and quietly said that the princess had asked for the wine to be brought to her table personally. The servant was taken aback but didn't argue. The prince consort, the princess's husband, he has the right. Ethan carried the tray to Celeste's table. He set it down. Then, quietly, into the ear of Hana Ju, who was standing behind Celeste, he whispered 3 words. The third glass. Poison. Hana didn't move. Her expression didn't change, but Ethan sensed a change in her scent. Adrenaline. Sharp. Metallic. Hana's body had switched to combat mode in a split second. She discreetly removed the third glass, replaced it with another. No one in the room noticed. The reception continued. Celeste drank wine from a safe glass. She smiled. She chatted with the ambassadors. She had no idea. Hana was standing behind her. She knew. And just once that entire evening, she looked at Ethan. A quick glance. A second. There was no contempt in that look. No cold assessment. There was something Ethan had seen only on Magnus's face that first day in the armory. Recognition. After the reception, Hana found him in the hallway. She was standing against the wall, her arms crossed. She said she'd tested the glass. Poison from the root of the white shadow. Fatal in 6 hours. No antidote. If Celeste had drunk it, she would have died by dawn. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily, not from fatigue but from realization. This wasn't an attempt on his life, or on Celeste's. Someone wanted to kill the queen. Hana said she'd find out who, that it was her job, that he didn't need to get involved. Then she paused, and added that he had saved Celeste, that she wouldn't forget it. And she left. Ethan stood in the hallway. His hands were trembling, slightly, like after a duel. He had saved Celeste. Because the bloodhound's keen sense of smell had kicked in today of all days. A coincidence, or maybe not. The voice every morning had been calm, tired, as if the speaker knew something he wasn't saying. A secret mission, Ethan thought. A bloodhound's sense of smell, to find what is hidden, to save someone in danger, to save a specific person. A warmth spread through his chest. A brief flash. A quiet ringing. The talent was preserved forever. 4 out of 4. 3 months after the wedding, Crane's workshop had doubled in size. 2 new furnaces, 8 apprentices instead of 4, a second workbench for small items, a shed in the courtyard for storing finished products, revenue of 30 silver coins a week, profit of 12. The debt to the treasury was paid off in full. Ethan's personal debt of 340 silver coins was paid off from his share of the profits. For the first time in 8 years, he owed nothing to anyone. Lillian kept the books impeccably. Every copper coin accounted for. Every transaction was tracked. She came in one morning and said she'd found a way to save 4 silver coins a week on delivery costs by rerouting the cart driver. Ethan looked at her calculations. Perfect. He told her she was a genius. Lillian dropped her pen. She picked it up. She dropped her notebook. She picked it up. She blushed. She ran off. Martha expanded the kitchen next to the workshop. Now she not only cooked lunches for the workers, but also sold hot takeout meals through a window in the wall. Soup, bread, porridge, cheap, hot, clean. Workers from neighboring streets began coming for food, a line of 10 people every noon. Extra income, 5 silver coins a week. Martha refused to take a cut. She said she was paid in the palace kitchen and that she wasn't doing it for the money. Ethan didn't argue, but he set up a separate account for her in Lillian's books. For the future, Hannah Ju found the poisoner, a servant in the buffet, bribed by the House of Castle, not by Volcor, by Castle, the quiet Darius Castle, with his smile and friendly visits. He offered Ethan friendship with one hand and poisoned his wife with the other. Hannah reported this to Celeste. Celeste summoned Castle to the throne room, one-on-one, without witnesses. Ethan didn't know what she said to him, but Castle emerged from the room looking gray, not pale, gray, like a palace wall in winter. A week later, the House of Castle recalled its 3 representatives from the palace administration. The steward resigned. The new steward was a man loyal to the Queen Mother. Celeste was learning, quickly, rigorously, quietly, as befits a queen. Iris Volcor came to the workshop in the 4th week of the 3rd month. Not to look out the window. Inside, in the morning, with a pipe in her hand, smoke curled above her head. She stopped in the doorway. She looked around the workshop, the smiths, apprentices, Lillian at the table, Magnus at the anvil, and Ethan, who was standing at the workbench explaining to Greg how to correctly calculate the number of strikes for a new type of clasp. Iris approached. Ethan turned. He read her face. The boredom was gone. In its place was something else. Hunger. Not physical, intellectual. She wanted to know. She wanted to understand how what she was seeing worked. Why were 4 untalented apprentices making better pieces than her father's master craftsman? Iris said she had come on behalf of the House of Volcor, that her father wanted to know the secret behind the quality of Crane's workshop, that she was willing to pay. Ethan saw through the lie at the first glance, and the truth at the second. Her father hadn't sent her. She'd come on her own. Driven by her own curiosity, Ethan smiled, quietly, politely. He said there was no secret, that everything was on the walls, the technical process, anyone can read it. And if Lady Volcor wanted, he'd show her the entire production process and explain every step, for free. Iris flinched. The muscle by her left eye, a micro-movement. Shock. No one had ever offered her anything for free before. Every interaction in her life had been a transaction. Every conversation had a price. And this man with an F rank was standing in front of her, offering to show her his work just like that. Ethan led her through the workshop. He explained the heating temperature and why it had to be exactly that, the type of hardening and why oil was used instead of water, standardization and why every apprentice followed the same instructions, tolerances and why every piece was measured. Iris listened, silently. The pipe went out, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were different, alive, sharp. She asked questions, smart questions, precise ones, about heat capacity, about the structure of metal, about the economics of standardization. Questions that no courtier, no aristocrat, no lord of the great house would ever ask because they considered them beneath their dignity. Ethan answered, honestly, fully, without guile. By the end of the tour, Iris was standing by the forge, staring into the fire. She said quietly that in her 20 years living in the House of Volcor, no one had ever explained to her how the forge, on which her family's entire fortune rested, worked. Ethan replied that this was a mistake. Iris looked at him for a long time. Then she put her smile back on, that haughty, sharp smile she wore like armor. She said she'd report back to her father, that there was no secret, that Crane simply had a different approach. Ethan nodded. She left. Magnus approached afterward. He asked why Ethan had shown her everything. Ethan replied that knowledge doesn't diminish when you share it, and that Iris Volcor would return, not for secrets, for what wasn't in her father's house, for the right to be smart. Magnus shook his head. He said that Ethan was either the craftiest person he knew or the most reckless. Ethan replied that the Queen Mother had told him the same thing. A week later, a girl appeared on the threshold of the workshop, skinny, dirty, 16 years old, eyes like a starving cat. She stood at the entrance and stared at the sign. Then she went inside. She walked up to Ethan and tried to snatch his wallet. Ethan grabbed her by the wrist, not hard, just a quick grab. He didn't have perfect coordination, but a blacksmith's hands are quick. The girl jerked away. She hissed. She tried to bite him. Ethan didn't let go. He looked at her. He read her face. Fear, hunger, anger, and beneath it all, despair. Total. Hopeless. She was an F rank. Ethan knew it without checking, just by her hands, by her eyes, by the way the world looked at her and the way she looked at the world. He let go of her wrist. She jumped back. She stood by the door, ready to run. Ethan asked her name. She remained silent. He asked if she was hungry. She remained silent. He turned to Martha and asked for a bowl of soup. Martha poured some. Ethan set the bowl on the workbench. He sat down. He started working. He didn't look at her. A minute later, he heard the spoon clatter against the bowl. 5 minutes later, the bowl was empty. The girl stood by the workbench and watched his hands. She watched how he worked on the piece of wood. Ethan asked again, "What's your name?" "Yuna." "Yuna so." Ethan nodded. He asked if she wanted to work. Yuna looked at him as if he were crazy. Ethan explained. 5 silver coins a month, 8 hours. Food, training, work. Yuna asked what the catch was. Ethan said the catch was that she couldn't steal anymore. Yuna snorted. Then she quietly said, "All right," and she stayed. The 6th month. Crane's workshop received a contract from the court, an official one, to supply steel products for the palace's household. Staples, hinges, locks, fasteners. A contract that had belonged to the House of Volcor for 10 years. Lillian prepared a comparison chart. Crane's price was 15% lower. The quality was confirmed by an independent inspection from the city council. The lead times are shorter. Celeste signed the contract at an open council meeting. Volcor lost its first official contract. Lord Volcor Sr. arrived at the palace that same day. He was portly, gray-haired, his face stony. He demanded an audience with the princess. Celeste received him. Ethan was present, as prince consort, by right. Lord Volcor spoke for 20 minutes. About tradition, about loyalty, about 3 generations of service to the House of Aurelion, about how awarding a contract to a commoner blacksmith was an insult to the great house. Ethan listened. He read his face. Volcor the Elder was nothing like his son. Marcus was cold and calculating. His father was passionate and proud, and beneath that pride, Ethan saw fear. Volcor was afraid, not of Ethan, of setting a precedent. If one contract is lost, others will follow. If others are lost, the vassals will begin to doubt. If the vassals begin to doubt, the house would collapse. 3 generations, in half a year. All because of a guy with an F rank and a tech process on the wall. Celeste listened. Her face was icy. She replied curtly, "The contract goes to whoever does it better for less money. That's the law. If House Volcor wants the contract back, let House Volcor learn to do it better." The audience is over. Volcor left. Heavy, slow, like a wounded beast. Ethan knew that a wounded beast is more dangerous than a healthy one. The next 2 weeks passed quietly. Too quietly. Ethan was waiting for the blow. The blow came from where he least expected it. Not from Volcor, from Irving. Richard Irving had left the capital after the duel. He returned to his ancestral castle. He remained silent for 4 months, and now he was back. But not alone. 40 knights of House Irving had arrived with him, officially to participate in the fall tournaments. Unofficially, 40 armed men loyal to Irving within the capital's walls. Hannah reported to Ethan personally. She arrived in the evening. She stood by the wall of his office. Her face was stony, but Ethan already knew her well enough. Hannah's stony face was her professional face. Work was being done behind the scenes. Fast, precise, dangerous. Hannah said that Irving was planning something, not a duel, not an assassination attempt, something on a larger scale. She didn't know what. But 40 knights in the capital, that wasn't a tournament. Ethan nodded. He asked how many people Hannah had. Hannah replied, 22, the princess's personal guard. Against Irving's 40, plus the city guard, which reports to the new commander but whose loyalty is unproven. Plus the fortress garrison of 200 men, but they answer to the council and the council is unpredictable. Ethan thought. 40 against 22. Bad odds. But numbers aren't everything. He asked Hannah if she knew which of Irving's 40 knights served out of conviction and which for money. Hannah looked at him. For the first time, there was a hint of something resembling respect in her eyes. She replied that roughly half were in it for their convictions. Fanatics of the house. The rest were mercenaries in crested cloaks. Ethan said that mercenaries needed money, and that Irving was running out of money. 4 months in the castle. No contracts. No income from the court. The duel had cost him his reputation, and his reputation had cost him money. Hannah was silent. She waited. Ethan continued. He wasn't going to fight Irving. He was going to offer his men a job. Hannah raised an eyebrow. For the first time since they'd met, an expression appeared on her face that even someone without special insight could read. Surprise. Ethan explained. Crane's workshop was expanding. They needed security. They needed transporters. He needed people for the new workshops he planned to open. He could offer Irving's mercenaries something Irving couldn't. Stability, a monthly salary, an 8-hour workday, meals, respect. Not loyalty to the house that uses them as pawns, work that has meaning. Hannah was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that he was crazy and that she would help. It was the first time Hannah Jew had offered to help. Not on orders, not out of duty, of her own accord. Ethan didn't show that he understood the significance of the moment. He just nodded, said thank you. Hannah nodded back. She left, and this time she didn't slow her pace at the door. A week later, 4 of Irving's 40 knights came to Crane's workshop, quietly, at night, without their coats of arms. Ethan was waiting for them, with the contracts Lillian had drawn up. A month later, there were 9 of them. Irving was losing his men one by one, like a tooth after another, quietly, unnoticed. Painfully. By the end of the 7th month, 26 people were working at Crane's workshop. Blacksmiths, guards, cart drivers, cooks, bookkeepers. Mira Kim arrived at the end of the 7th month, a healer from the Dragmar refugees, rank S in healing, tired, cynical, with a pipe clenched between her teeth and a string of curses on her tongue. She came because she'd heard that Crane's workshop had hot water and soap, and that the workers weren't being worked to the bone. She'd been healing people for 20 years. She'd saved hundreds. She's lost thousands. She came to Aurelian to forget, and she couldn't. She walked into the workshop. She looked around the washroom that Ethan had built in his very first month. Hot water from a boiler, soap made from ash and fat, clean rags for bandaging, a box of herbs for first aid. Mira stood in the washroom and said nothing. Then she turned to Ethan. She said that in 20 years of work, this was the first place where she'd seen someone think about workers' health before they got sick. Ethan replied that prevention is cheaper than treatment. Mira snorted. She said he sounded like a bureaucrat. Ethan replied that he was an engineer. Mira snorted again. Then she asked if he needed a doctor. Ethan said he did, very much so. Mira said she wasn't interested in a salary. She was interested in hot water and the right to tell anyone who got in her way to go to hell. Ethan said that could be arranged. The 9th month, Irving struck, not with a sword, by law. At the council meeting, Richard Irving stood up and demanded a repeat of the assessment ritual for the prince consort. According to ancient law, any member of the royal family can be subjected to a rank verification if the great house demands it and the council agrees by a majority vote. Irving had prepared himself. He hadn't been idle during his 4 months at the castle. He had been gathering votes, bribing, making promises, issuing threats. When he made his demand, 12 out of 20 council members voted in favor, a majority. Celeste could not veto it. The law predates the throne. The assessment ritual is scheduled for 7 days from now. Public, in front of the entire court, in front of the ambassadors, in front of the people. The crystal would reveal Ethan's rank, and when it showed an F, Irving would demand an annulment on the grounds of incompatibility. A prince consort with an F rank cannot sit beside an S rank queen. It is a disgrace. It is a threat. It is grounds for annulment. Ethan found out that evening. Celeste came to his chambers for the first time. Before, he had gone to her. She entered, closed the door, stood in the doorway, her face icy, hands at her sides. Her were white. She said she wouldn't let this happen, that she'd find a way to overturn the vote, that she'd destroy Irving before he destroyed them. Ethan read her face. Beneath the ice was panic. Quiet, controlled, but panic nonetheless. She was afraid of losing him. Not her husband, not the prince consort. Him, Ethan, the man who made broth for her mother and fixed the stoves and spoke softly and bowed first. The man with whom she could take off her crown. Ethan stood up. He walked over to her, close, just as she had approached him in the throne room 9 months ago. He looked into her eyes. He said there was no need to cancel anything, that he would go through with the ritual. Celeste looked at him. The ice on her face cracked. For a second, she whispered that the crystal would show an F, that the entire court would see it, that Irving would win. Ethan said it wouldn't. Celeste froze. She asked why. Ethan remained silent. He couldn't tell her everything. About the voice, about the daily talents, about the 4 preserved SSS rank abilities. It wasn't time yet. It was too dangerous. If anyone found out, they'd kill him that very night. He said one thing, that she hadn't chosen him by chance, and that he was asking her to trust him one more time, just like in the throne room, when she stood before him, afraid he'd say no. Celeste looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were moist. Then she quietly said, "All right," and she left. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she said that even if the crystal showed an F, she still wouldn't annul the marriage, that she didn't give a damn about the law, that Irving and the entire council and all the houses could go to hell, that she was the queen and she was the one who decided. And she walked out. Ethan stood in the empty chambers, and for the first time in 9 months, he didn't think like an engineer. He thought like a man watching a woman walk away, realizing she was worth it all. All the duels, all the poisonings, all the sleepless nights, everything. 7 days until the ritual. Ethan didn't know what the crystal would reveal. 4 preserved talents, an absolute ear for metal, reading micro-expressions, the voice of a craftsman, the sense of smell of a bloodhound, all SSS rank, but his base rank was still F. The edge, the mana channel, empty. The preserved talents worked in parallel. They didn't change the edge. They were something else, something the ranking system hadn't anticipated. Something the crystal might or might not reveal. Ethan didn't know, and there was no one to ask. Except for one. The voice. Every morning at dawn, the voice would come, calm, tired. It would name the talent of the day. Then it would leave. It never said anything else. It never answered the questions Ethan had asked mentally during the first few weeks. But Ethan remembered one detail from the very first day. The voice knew his name, his real one, his earthly one, and it waited for Ethan to ask the right question. The morning of the 5th day before the ritual, dawn, warmth in his chest, the voice, the daily talent received, clairvoyance, 10 seconds, SSS rank, lasts 24 hours. Ethan sat on the bed, clairvoyance, 10 seconds every 24 hours. He could see something, anything, for 10 seconds, once. He closed his eyes, asked a question, not about the ritual, not about the crystal, not about Irving. Another question. Who are you? 10 seconds. The world vanished. Ethan stood in a void, white, endless. An old man sat before him, on a simple wooden chair, thin, gray-haired, with hands scarred by burns, like a blacksmith's, just like Ethan's. The old man looked at him. Tired eyes. Kind. Infinitely kind. He said one sentence. My name was Arthur Wayne. I was an engineer, like you, 200 years ago. I failed. You haven't. The 10 seconds were up. Ethan opened his eyes. He was sitting on the bed. Silence. Dawn outside the window. His hands were trembling. Arthur Wayne, an engineer from another world, transported 200 years ago. A loser, left as an echo, passing the torch. A voice every morning, not a system, not a god, not a curse. A weary old man who watches over him and quietly prays that he'll fare better. Ethan sat motionless for 5 minutes. Then he stood up, got dressed, went to the workshop. He had 2 days until the ritual, and he finally knew what to do. The day's secret mission. To see the one behind the voice. To recognize him. To learn his name. A warmth spread through his chest. A brief ringing. The talent of clairvoyance. 10 seconds, saved forever. The day of the ritual. Morning. Dawn. Warmth in his chest. Arthur Wayne's voice. But this time, he didn't just say the name of the talent. Daily talent acquired. True sight. Rank SSS. Lasts 24 hours. And after a pause, you're ready, Ethan. I knew you'd be ready. The voice fell silent. Ethan sat on the bed. True sight. He opened his eyes. The world hadn't changed. Walls, the ceiling, light from the window, everything was the same. But when he looked at his hands, he saw them. Lines, thin, golden, running across his skin, along his veins, along his bones. They ran from his fingertips up his arms toward his chest, toward his heart. 5 lines, 5 preserved talents. Each line pulsed with its own light. Perfect pitch for metal, silvery. Reading micro-expressions, blue. The voice of a craftsman. Green, the sense of smell of a bloodhound. Amber, clairvoyance. White. The 5 lines converged at the heart and formed a knot. Warm, alive, pulsating. It was not a facet, not a mana channel. Something else. Something the ranking system didn't know or anticipate. Something built not by ritual, but by hand. Every day, with every action, with every stove repaired, every broth cooked, and every word of truth spoken. Ethan stood up. He got dressed. He put on the doublet Celeste had sent him. Dark gray, simple. He looked in the mirror. Golden lines shimmered beneath the fabric on his chest, invisible to the naked eye. Visible to true sight, visible to the crystal. The throne room, noon, 400 people, more than on the day of the selection. Lords, ladies, advisors, ambassadors, merchants, guildmasters, the city's elite, the people outside the gates. Rumors had spread throughout the capital. The prince consort is being tested. The talentless one is being tested. He'll get an F, and that'll be the end of it. Celeste sat on the throne. Crown, silver dress. Her face was icy. Her hands rested on the armrests. Calm. Steady. She had learned to hide her fear. Ethan noticed a single micro-movement. A muscle near her right eye. Tension. She held her ground. Hannah Ju stood behind the throne, her hand on her sword. 22 personal guards lined the perimeter of the hall, positioned to control every exit. Hannah was preparing for the worst. The Queen Mother sat to the right of the throne, upright, clear-eyed, healthy. 3 months of broth and care had transformed her from a sick old woman into a woman who looked 10 years younger. She looked at Ethan when he entered, and nodded slightly. Richard Irving stood in the front row, white uniform, gold epaulets, new. His face was calm, confident. He was confident of victory. Next to him was Darius Castle, pale after his conversation with Celeste, but here, watching, waiting. Marcus Volcor, unmoving, easy to read. On his face, Ethan saw not schadenfreude, interest, the same interest he'd shown in the workshop. He wanted to know. Lord Volcor Sr., heavy, gloomy, waiting for the fall. Lillian stood among the ladies in waiting, pale. Her hands were clenched, a notepad stuck out of her pocket, even now. Iris Volcor stood by a column, her cigarette hidden, her face haughty, but her eyes were different. Ethan could see it. She didn't want him to lose. She didn't want him to, and she didn't understand why. Yuna stood at the far end of the hall, among the crowd, skinny, defiant, eyes like a hungry cat's. She'd made her way into the palace on her own. No one had invited her. She came because she came. Martha stood next to Yuna, her hands on her chest, her face heavy. She wasn't praying. She was waiting, the way a woman waits who has stood in the kitchen for 22 years and watched those who didn't deserve to fall take their downfalls. Magnus stood by the wall, quiet, old, his hands scarred from burns. He wasn't looking at the crystal. He was looking at Ethan. And in his gaze was what Ethan had seen on the very first day, when the old man heard that this boy could hear metal. Recognition. Mira Kim stood by the door, a cigarette clenched between her teeth. To hell with protocol. She was smoking in the throne room, and no one dared to say a word to her. Greg stood among the crowd, next to Yuna. The other 3 apprentices were nearby. They had come, all of them, without an invitation, because their master was on his way to the trial. The priest stood at the altar, an old man, the same one from 8 years ago. White robes, a crystal on a stone pedestal, large, clear, cold. Ethan walked across the hall, 400 pairs of eyes, his heels clicking on the black marble, just like back then, just like Celeste on the day of the selection. Click, click, click. He stopped in front of the altar. The priest looked at him. With his true vision, Ethan saw the lines of mana in the priest's body, thin, even, ancient. The priest was an honest man. He didn't know what the crystal would reveal. No one did. The priest recited the incantation, an ancient one, in a language Ethan didn't know. But True Sight translated it. Show who he is. Ethan raised his hand. He placed his palm on the crystal, cold, smooth, stone, and the crystal flashed, white, just like 8 years ago. It flickered. Irving in the front row leaned forward slightly. He braced himself. He waited. White light, rank F, the end. But the white light didn't fade. It lingered, for a second, for 2, and began to change, slowly, from white to silver, from silver to blue, from blue to green, from green to amber, from amber to white again. 5 colors, 5 talents, 5 lines that lived within his chest, which the crystal had found, read, and revealed to the entire hall. Then all 5 colors converged toward the center of the crystal. They blended together, and the crystal slowly, evenly, and solemnly filled with gold. Not F, not A, not S, not SS, not SSS. Gold. No one in this hall had ever seen such a color. There was no such rank in the registry. It wasn't in the books. It had never been seen in the history of Aurelian. The priest stood there. He looked at the crystal. He slowly sank to his knees. Not because he was forced to, because his legs could no longer hold him. 400 people. Silence. Not absolute. Living. A silence in which you could hear a heartbeat. Richard Irving stood in the front row. His face was white. Not pale. White. Like a wall. Like snow. Like the end. He was looking at the golden crystal, and Ethan was reading his face, layer by layer. Shock. Denial. Fear. And beneath it all, beneath all the layers, understanding. He had lost. Not today. Long ago. The moment he looked through Ethan as if through glass and decided that there was nothing but emptiness before him. Darius Castle was smiling, but his smile was dead, a masquerade smile. The mask had cracked, and behind it was emptiness. Marcus Volcor stood motionless, but on his face, Ethan read something he hadn't expected. Relief. Marcus was glad. Not for Ethan, for himself. Because Marcus had long since realized that the world was changing and that one must be on the side of those who bring about that change. Lord Volcor the Elder stood with difficulty, leaning on his cane, and he gazed at the golden crystal with the eyes of a man who sees the end of an era. His era. Lillian was crying, quietly, into her palm. A notepad fell out of her pocket. She didn't notice. Iris Volcor stood by a column. Her phone lay on the floor. She dropped it. Her eyes were wide. Her lips were slightly parted. Her face bore that expression Ethan had seen only once, when she first laughed genuinely in his workshop. Freedom. Yuna stood in the back row, skinny, defiant, and was sobbing silently, just as she had back then by the horn when Ethan told her that rank wasn't who she was. Work was who she was. Martha stood next to Yuna. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. Widely, from ear to ear. Just like back then in the kitchen when he offered her a taste of the broth first. Magnus stood by the wall, an old blacksmith with burn marks on his hands. He was crying. Openly. Without shame. Because 50 years ago his father had forged the perfect sword and no one had heard it. And then a boy came along and heard it. Mira Kim stood by the door, a pipe clenched between her teeth. Her eyes were dry. She'd seen too much to cry. But she nodded. Once. Briefly. It meant more than tears. Greg stood among the crowd, standing tall, for the first time in his life not slouching. Next to him were 3 apprentices, all 4 of them, rank F. All 4 of them, standing straight. Because if their master is golden, then maybe rank really isn't everything. Maybe work really is everything. Hana Ju stood behind the throne, her hand on her sword, her face stony. But Ethan saw it, a single tear in her right eye. She wiped it away before anyone noticed, but Ethan noticed. Celeste sat on the throne, a crown on her head, a silver dress, an icy face. The queen. And Ethan saw with true vision that inside her, too, there were lines. Not golden, silver. Lines that stretched from her to him. Thin. Ancient. Lines of a prayer that a little girl had whispered in the heat 7 years ago. Please, someone who knows how to fix what's broken. Not a warrior, not a mage. Someone who fixes things. A prayer that reached Arthur Wayne at the other end of time. And he chose. He transported here the soul of an engineer who, in his own world, had fallen asleep at the wheel, because this engineer had spent his whole life fixing broken things. Ethan withdrew his hand from the crystal. The golden light remained. It pulsed, slowly fading. He turned. His eyes found Celeste. She sat motionless, icy, regal, and then she did something she had never done before. She rose from the throne, before the entire court, before all the houses, before all the ambassadors. She stepped down from the dais. She walked across the hall. 400 people parted before her, in silence. She walked toward him, her heels clicking on the black marble. Click, click, click. Just like on the day of the selection. Only this time, she wasn't searching. She knew. She approached him, stood before him, close, just like back then. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time in front of the entire court, she took his hand. His hand, with burns from the forge, with calluses from the hammer. The hand that repaired furnaces and cooked broth and forged nails that wouldn't bend. She took that hand and squeezed it. And very quietly, so that only he could hear, she said 4 words. "You're fixing it. I knew it." Ethan stood in the throne room. The golden light was fading in the crystal behind him. 400 people were silent. Celeste was holding his hand. And he had a single thought. Not an engineer's thought, a human one. Arthur Wayne lost 200 years ago because he was alone. Because no one took his hand. Ethan isn't alone. He has an old blacksmith who hears metal. A cook who feeds the whole world. A girl with a notebook who counts better than the treasurer. A thief who will become the kingdom's best blacksmith. A doctor who can't stop healing. A warrior who cries a single tear and wipes it away before anyone sees it. The enemy's daughter who wants to be smart, not beautiful. A mother who survived for her daughter's sake. And a daughter, a wife, a queen. A girl who, at 12, lying in the heat, asked the one who mends. Ethan squeezed her hand in response, and he answered quietly so that only she could hear. "You called. I came." The golden light in the crystal faded. The hall exhaled. Someone clapped. Then the whole hall. 400 people. But Ethan didn't hear them. He stood there, holding the hand of a woman who had once decided to choose neither a warrior nor a mage, but the one who fixes things. And he fixed things, every day, one thing for one person. And the world around him changed. Not because he was golden or SSS or invincible, because he listened to people, to metal, to the truth. Ethan Crane stood in the throne room of the Kingdom of Aurelian, the Queen's husband, the master, an engineer, a man who fixes things,